Welcome everybody to be here. We are so glad to welcome you to this event, to these conferences. It's the first one that we are doing in collaboration with Iberoamericana and UPAEP universities, our main host here, university host here in Puebla. So I am glad to introduce you to our presenters who are going to be here. First is Maestra Estefania Arreguín Zárate. She is a professor at the Iberoamericana University, and she works at the Centro Intercultural de Reflexión y Acción Social. Profesora Doctora Eva Ciadula is a teaching professor at Notre Dame University from the Economic Department. Professor Miguel Ángel Corona is a teaching professor at Iberoamericana University as well. So we are waiting for Professor Alfredo Quequecha, which is the professor at the Research Economic Department here in UPAEP. So we are welcome them and saying thank you for being here. So I would like to introduce you to Professor Ciadula, who is going to be our first presenter, and we are going to be delighted to hear her.
Thank you. Am I supposed to stand on top of it or not? Am I supposed to stand on this?
Yes, otherwise we are not going to see.
Okay. So I can't see my slides. Okay. I'll have to figure this out. I'll look over there. It doesn't matter. Actually, it's sort of. So that. Can you guys hear me just fine? Yeah, I think it's fine. Oh, but they need it for the video. That's right. Okay. Oh, so it is working. Okay. Okay, so thank you for coming. And I'm going to present joint work with Catalina Amoedo Dorantes at UC Merced. And me looking at the impact of granting driving privileges. So not necessarily a driver's license that you can go and vote with in the US, but a driving permit for undocumented migrants in the United States. And looking specifically at traffic fatalities. It's not moving. Okay, thank you. So here we go. So why would states actually care about extending driving privileges to their undocumented population, right? What's there for them to gain sort of is the first question, because there has been a decent number of states that have enacted these extensions of driving privileges. So in terms of the states' gains, we can think of the fact that once people can drive, they can actually get perhaps better jobs. They don't have to settle for work that is just close that they can take a bus to, right? They can drive to a job, they can have better opportunities. If you are licensed to drive, you can also actually get car insurance, which would, if people are insured and not leaving the scenes of an accident and getting people stuck with a large bill on their own, it should contain the insurance premiums for the existing drivers, hopefully. And in terms of just getting licensed, you have to pass the driving test. So the hopeful idea is that drivers on the road would actually be better drivers as well, and there should be fewer accidents. So when you look at the sort of evolution of this extension of driving privileges in the United States, it's still something that's still being considered in many states. Indiana is actually one of them. We have a student policy network at Notre Dame that's trying to help push this through I think they got it through the House, not quite to the Senate, or maybe the other way around this past term, but they're hoping to get some headway in the next term. But Massachusetts and Rhode Island did push this through last year, and it's going to become effective, I believe, July 2023. So states are still considering these extensions and moving ahead. I do have some quotes from New York where they're really happy about the outcomes after the laws have passed, that they don't have to spend a lot of time at just detaining people for not having a valid license, but they can focus on real issues of safety and sort of community building. So That's sort of the background. Now, this is a list of the states that have already adopted. So the sort of few, Washington was very early in 1993, and then it sort of gained bigger headwinds in like the mid 2010s. 12, 13, 14 were pretty busy. So there's a lot of variation across time in terms of when these states have adopted the policies. Now, the literature has already looked at several outcomes of this expansion. The evidence shows that there is certainly increase in the job opportunities, as you would expect. People are able to carpool, they can get to jobs that are further away, so their commuting times have risen, which is signaling they're hopefully getting a better match in terms of the jobs itself. We do see higher rates of people actually owning cars, and if you think in terms of the state's perspective, that's also an increase in revenue. You're getting registrations, you're getting people getting the licenses, right? All of this is a source of revenue for the state as well. But it didn't seem to change the number of drivers on the road. So to some extent, that's suggestive evidence that people were driving before anyways, just without the valid permit. There is a little bit of research done in states that had more restrictive policies, that when you actually do not allow this driving privilege to the undocumented, that car insurance premiums do go up, right? That you would have people who are unlicensed, perhaps worse drivers, and perhaps leaving the scene of the accident. So hit and runs. They're more prevalent than we would like to think, I guess. The US administration shows that a hit and run crash occurs about every 43 seconds. And unfortunately, there's been a steady increase in the prevalence of hit and runs over time in the United States. If you look at the most severe example of hit and run accidents, so fatal hit and runs, there's close to 2,000 of them every year. As a percentage, it's a small percentage, right? Most of the hit and run accidents are not fatal, but in terms of a total number, that's still a lot of lives that are lost in this type of a crash. Now, why would we sort of care about hit and runs? If somebody causes an accident or maybe is a victim and they didn't cause the accident, but they still make the decision to flee the scene of the crash and run away, we're potentially delaying the arrival of first responders, right? If nobody's calling 911 and saying that somebody's in trouble, there's a potential delay in sort of help. If you are leaving and your insurance company is not sort of helping to pitch to cover the cost of the repairs, it's also going to be adversely affecting the premiums of the people who were affected and stayed on the scene. So premiums would rise in this case, and that means higher out-of-pocket costs for the victims, right? So there's concerns in terms of hit-and-run accidents that we would be worried about. Why should driving privileges matter? So when you look at studies that have actually been able to identify people who later got caught for a hit and run, one of the most common traits among them is that they did not have a valid license, right? That's why they ran, because they didn't want to get in more trouble for driving unlicensed, so they left the scene of the crash. Now, if you think about the undocumented population specifically, the concerns are even bigger for them, right? Because in many states, if you will eventually perhaps find a pathway to try to gain permanent residency in the United States, you cannot have criminal record, right? There's certain amount of infractions that are perhaps allowed, but if you are faced with the decision, okay, I got in this accident and I don't know what's going to happen, and if it's going to be on my record, I might not have a way to be able to stay in this country, you are much more likely to make the decision to actually flee and not wait for the police and the first responders and just try to not get caught. And that's even if you actually didn't cause the accidents. There's plenty of evidence that the undocumented in the US are much less likely to report any crime, even if they were victims of the crime, because they just do not want to encounter law enforcement and be sort of in the system, right? So even if it wasn't their fault, they're much more likely to actually leave the scene of the crash. There is evidence of them wanting to drive less, which is impacting ultimately their children. They do not go for parent-teacher conferences at the schools, right? Like all of these things that you just have a fear of driving unlicensed, that you just do not want the interactions that's adversely affecting their outcomes. So there is one study that has looked at only California and the impact of extending the driving privileges in that state specifically on the prevalence of hit and run accidents. In our study, we're going to look at fatal hit and runs, so the ultimate kind of the most severe case. This study in California looked at any type of a hit and run accident. And they tried to sort of use the strategy of seeing how many of these new permits, these new driving cards were issued in each county, and then see how the prevalence of hit and runs varies by those counties, right, in the 1 year following the expansion of these driving privileges. So they only have one state, they only look at 1 year of the post outcomes, but they do find a reduction in the percentage of the accidents in the states that end up being hit and runs, right? So as far as how many people run away as a percentage of the total accidents, so kind of abstracting from is there more or less traffic accidents, but the share of them, right, what percentage do people run away from, there was a reduction. So we kind of looked at that as, okay, that's a public safety concern, right? The hit and runs is something that would be much more applicable to the undocumented immigration. And we're choosing to pursue this project by sort of contributing to this existing literature by looking at multiple states. So we're looking at the US overall. We're looking at sort of a larger sample in terms of the dates. So we're going to start in 1990 and go all the way up to 2019, the latest available that was at that point, to kind of look at all of the states that went through this expansion throughout that time. And we're going to address some of the issues that have come up in the literature, because if it's easy if you look at sort of California, because they had implemented the policy at one time, right? So there's a clear sort of pre-period and a clear post-period, and you can compare the outcomes in the pre and post. When you have a lot of states that have implemented the policies at different times, and you want to be using a set of states that are serving as a control, as your placebo, that never had adopted the policy, and use them to contrast the changes, it becomes really difficult when states have adopted the policy at different times, right? Because if you're trying to designate the pre and post period for your placebo control states, which year do you choose? Do you choose the year that Washington implemented, or California implemented, or New Mexico, right? Like it's not clear, and it causes challenges for us in econometrics to figure out how to actually do this estimation in a feasible and believable way, I guess. So we're trying to deal with the nuances of that as well. So in the US, we actually publish a census, so not a sample, but a complete record of all fatal accidents in the United States. Accidents count as fatal if there was a death either on the scene or within 30 days of the crash. They're going to be recorded in this data set, and it is publicly available. So we have information on the location of the accident, so we know which state it was in. Now, for drivers who remained, you also know the issuing state of their driver's license. But in the case of hit and run accidents, since the driver left, we have no information on the drivers. So all we can use is the state in which the accident actually happened. But we know what type it was, whether it was head-on, rear end, side swipe, right? We know the weather conditions, the temperature, the time of the day of the week. As you could imagine, hit and runs are going to be probably related to what other than like the undocumented concerns that we already thought about. I'm going to pick on my students since they're here. What else do you think would cause you to want to leave the scene of a crash if you cause an accident? What might be another factor? When would drivers leave? No? Paulina?
No insurance.
Okay, if you have no insurance, absolutely.
If you have like a history of accidents and it's, even if you have insurance, that's going to be costly.
Okay, perhaps if you've already been in trouble. Like, what about Saturday night, Friday night? Drinking, that's right, alcohol consumption, right? So the day of the week also matters, right? So we want to kind of capture all of these differences that might affect the probability that the accident will be a hit and run, right? So we want to know whether it was a weekend evening. We want to know if it was late at night, because that's also more likely, right? You might fear less that you'll get caught because there's not a lot of people that have maybe witnessed, right? You might have been more likely to be drinking. And so forth. So all of this information that's actually provided about the accident is going to be useful for us to try to really kind of control for all of these other factors that might have an effect. Now, what we do with the data is we actually collapse it at the state level because these policies are state level policies, right? We're not looking at the decision of this individual driver, whether or not he left or she left the scene, because we don't have information on those drivers. So we're going to be looking at sort of what's happening at the state level. So how many accidents are there in each state and how it's sort of changing over time. And we're going to be looking at sort of 3 outcomes initially. We're ultimately really interested in the share, so the percentage of the fatal accidents that are hit and runs. But you could see that the percentage of hit and runs could be affected by sort of changes in both the numerator and the denominator, right? Because ultimately, to calculate the percentage, you take the number of fatal hit and runs out of all of that were hit and runs, right? Out of all of fatal accidents. So you could see a reduction in the share if maybe there's now just more accidents that are fatal, and the number of hit and runs didn't change, right? But the percentage would be lower. You could see that if the hit and runs are going down, but maybe overall safety is also going down and there's fewer fatal accidents. So while the percentage is kind of our preferred measure, we also want to make sure that it is not driven by the change in the composition. So we're going to look at sort of a count measure, the number of fatalities per 100,000 people in the population, the number of hit and runs per 100,000, and then look at the percentage. So basically the share of these two. Okay, now where would we expect this policy to actually have an impact? I would not expect this policy to have a big impact on the hit and run percentage in states that have no undocumented immigrants, right? If you extend the privilege to this group and they're not really living in that state, we're not going to see a change. So what we do is we actually take the US Census data from 1990, which is prior to any of these expansions happening throughout these states, and we try to figure out what the share of undocumented in each state is, right? Like, what is the percentage there? We focus on Mexican non-citizens with less than high school education as sort of a proxy to capture who is most likely to be undocumented at that point. So we take each state, look at the percentage share of less than high school educated non-citizens from Mexico. And then on top of that, to kind of make the measure a little bit more precise, we use what's referred to as the residual method in this type of literature, which actually looks at the occupations of these people, right? If you report that you work for the post office in the US, you have to be a US citizen actually to work for the post office. So to us, that's a clear indicator you're not undocumented, right? If you work in occupations that require state licensing, you likely need to have a legal permanent residency as well. So this residual approach is basically taking everybody who's in occupations that are likely requiring some proof of residency and taking them out of the sample, and all that you're left with, that's the residual, right, are the ones that are most likely undocumented. So we try to really kind of capture as best as we can the proxy measure for the share of the population in the state that's undocumented. And then we focus on only the states sort of, they're roughly in the top decile of the states that have the most undocumented immigrants as their share of the population in the state. And this is going to be our final sample that we'll be working with. So this is what it gets us down to. So the dark shaded states are the states that we've identified that have the highest share of undocumented in the US. And the lines that go across identify the states that have actually adopted the expansion of driving privileges. So you can see there's some overlap in both the states that don't have a lot of undocumented immigrants, and there's some overlap in the dark shaded states that do have a higher share as well. And these are sort of our basic descriptive statistics about the accidents that we record. So if you look at the number of fatal hit and runs per 100,000, there's roughly 0.066 per 100,000, right? It's not very common. For fatalities, we have about 1.15 per 100,000 on average in these states. And the percentage of hit and runs is somewhere around 6%. Right? So it's not small if you think about that. If you, all fatalities, and 6% of them, people flee the car accident scene, right? It's not a small number, especially in this very serious type of accident. The columns 3 and 4 actually show you the averages in states that adopted the policy before the policy adoption, and column 4 is showing you the averages after the policy adoption. And this is sort of the sniff test, like, do we think there should be an impact, right? So if we think the policy had an impact, we would expect the percentages to be lower after the implementation. And it seems like before the adoption, the hit and run share was about 6.3, after it was 5.9. So that gives you some confidence, okay, maybe this is worth looking into, right? But there is a lot of other things that could contribute to these changes, and that's where the econometric analysis will come in. So our main specification is going to be kind of using that difference in difference method, but it has to be adjusted for the fact that the changes do not happen at the same time. So you don't have sort of a clear pre and post period. So we use a two-way fixed effects method that controls for the states and for the timing as well. And the coefficient of interest is that beta that tells us the policy is now active. Right? So this is in states that adopted, and it is after the implementation. Now, in terms of the rest of the equation, it's the characteristics of the car crash that we want to make sure we account for. And we've added a few more controls into this that kind of are related to what we discussed as why would people want to leave the scene of the crash, right? Is it on a weekend? Is it on an evening, right? We merged in data on unemployment in these states at the monthly level. There's evidence that looking at unemployment rates and how that correlates to, for example, drinking and people being sort of disparate that they don't have a job and they might have a higher level of alcohol consumption. We merge in the state level kind of fear of apprehension for the undocumented. So we have an index that captures policies at the state level that measure the intensity of how sort of intense the enforcement of whether it's state or local police is against the undocumented population. We merge in whether the states became sanctuary states and have laws that prevent police and some of the branches to actually ask people to provide proof of residency, right? So all of these things might affect your probabilities to either stay or flee the scene of the crash. So we merge all of these things into the estimation to look at our first kind of stab at results, and we're going to look at the three different outcomes. So the main message here in the first column is the percentage share that we're interested in, and the coefficient on the policy being in effect in these states is telling you that out of the 6% average rate of hit and run fatalities, we expect a 1.4 percentage point reduction. So off of 6%, 1.4 lower, that's over 20%, right? So in terms of the magnitude, like it's a tiny number, but when the average is 6, reducing it by 1.4 is actually very large impact, right? Now, looking at columns 3 and 4, is it because there are just fewer hit and run fatalities? And that seems to be the case, right? The number of fatal hit and runs per 100,000 people in the population is going down by about 0.024 off of a mean of 0.066. That's a 35% reduction off of the mean. So we have clearly fewer hit and runs. And in column 5 and 6, we confirm that it's not because the roads are just safer that there's fewer fatalities, because we don't see any significant change in the number of fatal accidents, period. The only change we see that's significant is the change in the hit and runs. But accidents, fatal accidents in all of these states are no different before and after the policy was implemented. So we're pretty confident that our results are causal here and that this is really telling the story that we were kind of predicting with the theory. Now, I already kind of hinted on this at the beginning that the issue of this staggered timing, that the states are implementing the policies at different times, makes it really complicated in terms of the estimation. Because you're always looking for the comparison with the placebo group, right? The state that never got the treatment. And as long as you're comparing to states that never got treated, that's okay, that's what you want. But when you have states that implemented the policies at different times, when you get to the later period, you have some states that have just implemented the policy, and in your sort of comparison group are going to be states that have already implemented maybe 10 years ago. Now, when the estimations are being computed, the softwares in the first type of regression that I showed you are actually going to be trying to make all possible combinations of comparisons. And one of the comparisons is going to be to the group that already got treated in the past. And that kind of is a bad comparison, right? Because it's not a clean comparison group. It's not your placebo. It's a state that already received the treatment. And it turns out that it could bias the results in a way. So there's a few new techniques that sort of decompose these comparisons and clearly compare just to the states that have never ever received treatment. Then they compare to states that will receive treatment later. And then they isolate these kind of bad comparisons to states that received treatment earlier and are kind of muddying up the results here. So the decomposition is what I'm going to show you here. So the average effect is very similar here to what I showed you in the first table, which makes us feel fairly confident that the bias is hopefully not too large, because we still see a significant reduction of about 1 percentage point. And then when we look at states who did receive the treatment, so we kind of shrink our sample to only the treated states. Now, the reason there is when you look at, I showed you the map of which states did receive the policy expansions and which didn't, right? So the states that expanded in my sample were Illinois, New Mexico, Nevada, I forgot my last one. But the states that did not, did you notice which states didn't, that have a lot of immigrants and did not implement? Texas and Arizona, that's right. So if the first group of states, and California, that's my fourth treated. So California, Illinois versus Texas and Arizona, what's the difference there? Are they very similar? Is it a good comparison? I'm using them as that placebo check, right? Because they're high undocumented share, but they didn't implement, but they're not the same. Like you literally have Democrats and Republicans going completely opposite directions, right? So some of the literature is also showing that like, okay, like it fits the placebo story, but at the same time, they're not your ideal comparison, right? If they're really different, maybe you shouldn't be using them. So as another sort of check, we only focus on the states that eventually will adopt, right? So we kind of exclude the states that might be just inherently different, that never adopt, that are different, and we're getting a stronger result in column 2. The bottom is the decomposition that I talked to you about. So the very bottom row is showing you that comparing to the never treated group, right, the always kind of the placebo, the clean check, is giving our estimate about 65% of the weight. The top in the decomposition is the earlier treated versus the people who have not yet been treated. They'll get treatment later. That's still okay. That's the next 25% of our weight. And that forbidden comparison is our middle group there. We're only getting about 10% push into our estimation from that bad comparison group. So most of our kind of is coming from the good comparison. So again, that kind of makes us feel better about getting the final results. Okay. The other approach is to actually, instead of bunching people in these groups, is literally taking just two states and 2 months at a time and computing these like simple comparisons, so thousands of them in a way. But instead of lumping people in these groups, really doing like a computationally heavy method of these smaller comparisons to avoid the potential bias. Using this method, we get about a 3.5 percentage point reduction. It's a little bit noisy, so we don't get significance in the main sample, but when we use the treated-only comparison, it does become significant. But when we, again, decompose this result into the pre-period and the post-period, so kind of looking at how the states looked, you can see that the pre-average between the two states, the two groups of states, right, that ever got the policy and that didn't, there's no difference. In terms of the share of hit and runs, they were identical, right? But after the policy implementation, the treated states in both of these samples had about a 0.5 percentage point or 5 percentage point reduction in the hit and runs. And this is an event study sort of showing the monthly comparisons. So until policy adoption, you don't see any differences, right? They're all kind of jumping up and down around 0. And after the policy implementation, the treated states' share of hit and runs clearly drops down way below 0, showing that there's been a significant reduction. And if I haven't convinced you enough, then we do a kind of a battery of falsification checks, making sure that this is not a random result that happened sort of by chance, right? So first, we're like, okay, so we looked at states that have a lot of undocumented in their population, right, where we would expect it to have an impact. So what if we looked at states that have the lowest percentage of the undocumented in the United States, right? And that's your column 1. In those states, there's no impact of the policy implementation, right? Because there's few people being affected, we wouldn't expect to see that. The other check we did is looked at states that have a lot of refugees. Refugees, when they come to the United States, they get legal residency, right? They can go and get a license, so they are expected to be legal. We, again, wouldn't expect this policy expansion to affect them. Again, in column 2, the policy had no differential impact on in these states and their share of hit and runs. We also worry about sort of reverse causality, right? Could it be the case that because these states had a lot of hit and runs, they actually adopted these policies, right? So if we sort of flip the direction of the relationship and test whether the intensity of hit and runs in a state, does that predict whether or not you adopt the policy, just as a 0-1, that's your column 1, or does it predict the timing, so the year and month in which you adopted the policy? And we don't see anything, right? So it doesn't seem to be driven by the prevalence of hit and runs in these states that they eventually went to the adoption. We also worry, and this is sort of the policy issue that comes up when this goes through the legislation in the states, that you're going to give sort of this perverse incentive to the undocumented and give them a free pass and say, this is okay, right? Like you can break the law, you can be undocumented, and we'll still let you get a license. And they worry about people moving to these states because of these reasons, right? So what we do is we lag the policy by 13 months in our case, because some of our data is annual, and we look at the percentage of both the undocumented in a state and both just immigrants, period. And we look whether the policy adoption is changing the percentage of immigrants and the undocumented in each state that adopted the policy. And we do not see any evidence of migrants moving into these states following the policy adoption and changing the state's composition at all. Okay, so summarizing our results, it does not seem to be driven by changes in just fatalities in states. It is clearly driven by the reduction in hit and runs that translates into the lower percentage of hit and runs in the fatal accidents. The size is very large in this context, right? In terms of the percentage, it's somewhere between 20 and 50% reduction in the likelihood of the accidents being hit and runs. And we do observe this over a long period of time, right? And the results are very stable to all of our different checks that we've presented. Now, in the 2 control states that I had showed you, Arizona and Texas, in just the very last year in the data that we have in 2019, they had 666 fatal hit and runs. I know I told you they might not be the best comparison to the other states, right, because they're inherently different. But if you sort of extrapolate and say, okay, if in those states, because they also have a high percentage of undocumented immigrants, if we could observe this reduction that we measure in all of the other states, they could reduce that rate by 20 to 50%. That's 133 to 333 fewer fatal hit and runs. That's not trivial, and that's just 2 states and in 1 year, right? That effect is pretty meaningful. Now, can we guarantee that they would not become fatal? No, right? In some of these accidents, it might be too late regardless. But even if you think of one life being saved because you call 911 and you're not fleeing the scene, if you look at statistical estimates of a value of a life in the U.S. are close to $12 million for the future lifetime earnings. Like there's a lot to be gained, right? Whether it's the insurance premiums that we talked about, all of these things are pretty significant impact. And we are looking at the most extreme set of results in fatal hit and runs. If this translates into your, other 99.7% of hit and runs that are not fatal, if we would see a reduction in people fleeing the scene of regular hit and runs that didn't end up fatal, and we can contain those and we can have better outcomes there, our results would really just be sort of a lower bound in this type of framework. And that is it. So I'm happy to take questions. Is that the next one, Lisette? Or how does, yes. Um,
Yes, thank you, Professor. Now we are going to give the word to Professor Miguel Angel. I think that he has some comments to do. It's going to be in Spanish, I suppose. Mhm.
Yes.
I'm not off the hook then, okay.
Very slowly.
Stefania can help us.
Bien, pues me parece que este trabajo es muy pertinente para la realidad norteamericana de nuestro de México. ¿Por qué? Voy a hacer un contexto, después me refiero al trabajo, doctora Eva, y después les voy a platicar de experiencias que cercanos a personas en donde el tener una licencia fue determinante para su vida allá en los Estados Unidos. Bueno, primero, tenemos que decir que
I think if you want, we could go. Okay, so before getting to the comments of your presentations, he wants to share what is really important, all that you present for our Mexican fellows here in Mexico, for giving a little bit of context of before going. And later on, he also is going to share some stories from people that he met in the US that having a driver's license changed their lives.
Listo. Bien. Como ustedes saben, hay una gran cantidad de población de origen mexicano en los Estados Unidos. Casi 40 millones de 3 generaciones.
So as you may know, there are more than 40 million people from Mexico in the U.S. from three generations in the last decades.
Y ellos han sobrevivido pues de muchas maneras. Llegaron la mayoría siendo indocumentados y poco a poco han ido obteniendo sus permisos para estar allá.
Some of them have changed also their status. Some of them arrive undocumented, and through the different years they have become legal permanent residents and citizens.
Sin embargo, como este proceso de obtención de documentos ha sido muy lento, pues no han tenido manera de tener una identificación en los Estados Unidos a menos de que sea una licencia de manejo.
But because of all this paperwork that they have to do in order to get a permit, all this time that it takes for them to become legal residents, having a driver license, it's one of the most important for having like an ID.
Imaginen ustedes que llegan a un país en donde no tienen autorización para estar y el riesgo y la incertidumbre que viven es muy alto.
Imagine that you're going to a country when you don't have a lawful permit to stay. Release uncertainty times.
La licencia presenta un documento, no para trabajar, sí para tener cierto grado de existencia en los Estados Unidos.
So having a driver's license, it's not only for having an ID. Not only for driving, but also for having an ID, having identification, like.
De ahí la importancia de que en algunos estados donde la proporción de mexicanos es alta, bueno, pues han tenido, digamos, la concesión de dar licencias de manejo.
That's why some of the states that they shared before, it's when they have like a big concentration of Mexican population or immigrant population, that's when they have become with some of these laws for allowing the driver license.
Y han utilizado las licencias de manejo pues para hacer muchas de sus actividades económicas, como abrir una cuenta bancaria.
Having that driver license allow them to do other different activities like opening a bank account because that's their ID.
Bien, cuando leo este trabajo, me es muy claro ver que a partir de una medición exacta, rigurosa, se puede comprobar que cuando se dan este tipo de políticas en cuales incluso a la población que no tiene autorización tienen una licencia, sus comportamientos, al menos en este caso que es el de manejar, tiene repercusiones favorables para la sociedad.
It's really good to see about this research, how specific with the specific measurements, their findings about how for immigrants or irregular documented people, having this driver license allow them not only to drive, but also to see different specifics about their behavior for the society.
Y el estudio el trabajo que hace la doctora Eva es muy minucioso, pero también, además de pertinente, muy cuidadoso en el sentido de poder diferenciar el tipo de accidentes y las consecuencias que tienen para poder identificar los efectos que tiene una política sobre la población indocumentada.
And the findings are really good in also sharing the different impacts and effects according to the different types of accidents that might be, and how also this will allow to have different policies.
De acuerdo con sus resultados, se nota que efectivamente el impacto sobre esa proporción de los 100,000 habitantes no se ve, digamos, impactada, pero sí se ve en el caso de aquellos que tenían el accidente y huían, o en aquellos que atropellaban y atropellaban.
Having these comparisons between the hit and run, but also the fatalities, gives another good perspective of the difference. As you said, like, it's not only thinking about the 100,000 population, but more specific about communities when this is a social impact.
Y a partir de estos trabajos se puede uno dar cuenta que si se dan condiciones de integración de los mexicanos al sistema de instituciones en los Estados Unidos, puede haber beneficios.
And it's good to know about this research, that if we have other policies and these findings could help to have benefits for communities, for undocumented, and bring them more close to this society.
Entonces, gracias doctora, porque esto contribuye a comenzar a cambiar la visión de nuestros compatriotas en los Estados Unidos.
So thank you, Dr. Eva, for sharing this, because also for us, give us the opportunity to give a different conception of how the Mexican documented immigrants are in the U.S.
Y ojalá y otros estados se vayan incorporando a estas facilidades, sobre todo porque no se puede negar que la presencia de nuestros compatriotas mexicanos allá contribuye a aumentar la productividad y la competitividad de la economía norteamericana.
So hopefully other states will also take these policies and have other opportunities for driver license, because that would also show how Mexicans bring many things to those states, to those places, not only for production, for labor, but also for competitivity.
Thank you.
Bien.
That was very nice. You guys have any questions, or we moving on? Okay, Emma, go.
Are you familiar with how the license for, like, is
Sí, sí,
distributed?
sí.
Is there a test or, like,
Yeah, so they have to pass sort of the same things that you would for a license, but it's not like, so most of the states in the US by now have been adopting this real ID, right, that you can fly with and stuff. So these are not your real IDs. It is a driver's permit, right, that it looks kind of like a license, but you cannot use it to vote, you cannot use it to get on a plane. It's just a permit to drive, right? So it's still limiting, and there's some concerns that, like, okay, so it still sort of gives you away, right? That, like, you so that people wouldn't maybe take it up in rates that we would hope for them, but clearly some of them do take that up, and it does make their lives a lot easier, right? Even though there's still some fear of sort of being now registered and people clearly having an idea of why you have this type of license, right? But
so one follow-up to that. So then do you expect that the decrease comes mostly from people now reporting it because they feel safe because they have the license? Or could part of it be from, like, now they're safer drivers because they're going through our tests, like, depending on country of origin, they could have different driving laws? Could part of the decrease be from, like, now they're safer drivers?
so if it was the safer drivers, right, we would just see fewer fatal accidents. Right? That's you would just see fewer people being affected, there fewer deaths resulting from accidents, that if we saw that there's fewer fatalities, period, that we could say, okay, now they're clearly better drivers, right? We see improvements in overall traffic safety, but we don't. The number of fatalities have not changed. The only thing that budged is how many people run away. Right? We just see fewer people running away from the scene of the crash, but we don't see a significant change in the number of fatal crashes per population, right? So that's exactly what's sort of the concern, right? Like, we're really interested in the percentage, but then everybody's going to be like, well, but how did that change, right? So that's why we're showing both of the sort of the numerator and the denominator of that share to show where that causality is coming from. But that's great, yes. Paulina? In terms of protections, no, so not into this, right? But if you do have that driver's permit that allows you to legally drive, if you get pulled over, and if you didn't have a license, that is an infraction, right? That in some states, it depends on how, you know, it gets classified in the sort of legal system, how big of a deal it is to be busted without a license. But it could lead to one of your, you know, 3 and out strikes. So if you have this valid driving permit, you don't get that strike against you, right? But in terms of protections, that when you get this type of license, that you would be protected from other things, that's not quite there. Okay.
Bueno, me faltó contarles estas anécdotas relacionadas con las licencias de manejo. Yo estuve haciendo una estancia de investigación en la Universidad de la Ciudad de Nueva York y estuve viviendo con migrantes. No estuve en el housing de la universidad. Y eso me permitió desayunar y cenar todos los días con mis compañeros de cuarto, de residencia, de casa.
So he will share some of these stories about some immigrants in New York when he was doing residence in the University of City of New York.
City of New York, yes.
When he was living with the immigrants, he wasn't staying at the residence dorms, and so he would have breakfast and dinner every single day with them.
Yes. Uno de ellos se dedicaba a transportar la tierra que sacan de la cimentación de los edificios a otro lugar, y de eso vivía. Para él era fundamental contar con una licencia de manejo para poder estar. Cuando yo lo conocí, llevaba 22 años allá y no tenía papeles, pero la licencia le permitía sobrevivir, que es algo que se mencionó en el trabajo, doctora Eva, ¿verdad? Que les da mucha movilidad, les da movilidad laboral, les abre oportunidades, les da seguridad. Y mi tocayo, porque se llamaba igual que yo, en realidad era pues muy activo, participaba mucho. Entonces ahí nos podemos dar cuenta de que tener una licencia de manejo es importantísimo, ¿no? Y por supuesto se cuidaba de no tener accidentes, porque eso es importante. Y lo otro que les quiero comentar es que en ese...
Si quieres contar. Okay, so one of the stories is about this person, his same name, Miguel, as this Miguel, and he had 22 years living in U.S. without documents. So he was undocumented, but he needed that driver license because he worked in construction for pulling up all those debris from the buildings. So he really needed to have that one in order to have a job. But also that made him be more responsible about driving because he knew that he needed to drive, he needed to be around because of this job.
Bien, otra historia muy breve y rápida. Fíjense, conocí a una persona que era una líder comunitaria en Staten Island. Ella, por ejemplo, los días miércoles les daba de comer a los migrantes, bueno, allá a los inmigrantes que no tenían papeles. Y cuando yo la entrevisté, me contó parte de su historia.
So this is another woman that every Wednesday, she was living in Staten Island, she would bring food for undocumented people and as a volunteer.
Yes. Ella era de aquí, de la Mixteca, que es la parte, digamos, más tradicional de la migración hacia los Estados Unidos.
So she was here close by from Mixteca, which is one of a big area that sends or have these push and pull factors from Puebla to New York.
Bien, cuando ella se fue con su esposo y 4 hijos, ella pues vivía bajo las reglas o las condiciones familiares que se viven en muchos lugares todavía en México, en donde la mujer no tiene derecho de hablar en una mesa cuando están los hombres.
So when she migrates with her husband and her 4 children, she had all these cultural concepts about being the wife and cannot step back. She couldn't be like speaker. She had to relate to her husband and respect kind of that natural cultural concepts from Mexico.
Entonces, imaginen que cuando yo la conozco y es toda una líder comunitaria, uno se pregunta, ¿cómo es que viene de esas condiciones?
So when I met her, she was a community leader, and so I started thinking, how did she, coming from the Mixteca, and when she wasn't able to talk, and now she's have a different behavior as a woman.
Bueno, entonces, pues, un día llegó un problema de carácter económico a su familia y lo que sucedió fue que la señora, a través de pues, las relaciones que había hecho con otras mujeres, logró conseguirle una licencia de manejo a su esposo.
So when they had some financial problems already in the U.S., she came together with other women, and because of her leadership, she was able to get a driver license for her husband.
Y desde entonces el señor pues hizo lo que ellos llaman una compañía de jardinería, y cuando yo los entrevisté les iba muy bien. Ahí está otra forma en cómo precisamente el contar con una licencia les da más apego a las instituciones de Estados Unidos, pero también les da la posibilidad de mejorar sus condiciones de vida.
So when they got the driver's license, they were able to fund gardening company. They have the driver's license. They were able to go back and forward with this business. And for kind of final closings from Miguel, he says that this is another example of how having this driver license would allow not only to drive, to have a job, financial benefits, but it also makes them to feel closer to the institution, a bit more respectful about the state or the federal institutions.
Entonces se dan cuenta cómo hasta una licencia pudo lograr que una mujer superara esas barreras, digamos, familiares. Eso no se lo habían preguntado, pero vean también lo que puede hacer de acceso a los mexicanos en Estados Unidos.
So having these type of policies for granting driver's license also brings other opportunities, more social impacts in families. This woman, this leader, she was able, because she was pursuing this driver license, she empowered herself. So that's another impact that these type of policies could bring to society.
Yeah, gracias.
Thank you. I think we're switching now, right? Yeah.
I have a final question for Eva. Eva, so you also share about these outcomes if you include the sanctuary cities. Did you find something that also kind of empower them to be driving, or like increasement in hit
So
and
we're
runs?
not looking at it as like an outcome, right? We're just controlling for it, but the expectations would be that likely they're going to be less afraid to flee the scene of the crash. But at the same time, you could have the same concerns that people are moving there on purpose, so you could also have more of an impact, right? So we're just using it as a control in the estimation, but not looking at it as an outcome of interest in this study. But yeah, it's
Did you see this policy particularly impacting a certain age population? For example, like could you actually help a younger population?
So we don't know how old they are because they fled the scene, so we don't have their information, right? So all we're measuring is sort of the percentage at the state level, but we can. It would be awesome if we could know who these people were. But all we observe is that there was a crash, and somebody left, right? So, but generally hit and runs are more common among younger people, right? So uninsured, unlicensed, and younger males on a weekend tend to be the population that is in this more than others. That's true. Yeah, that would be great, right? But we just, by the definition of a hit and run, they left, so we don't know who they are. That's great. Okay. Oh, hola.
Good morning. How easy is to get license to USA? Is it easy or less hard?
So with these licenses, I mean, for states that allow them, it's relatively easy, right? But it's only about 20 states at this point that will allow the access to them.
What are the requirements to get the
So I think it varies by state. I don't know exactly what it takes, but I'm assuming some sort of ID, right? So you'll have to have a passport or maybe the matriculas, right? That people from Mexico might have. So you need some sort of a legal proof of who you are, and then generally a residency in the state.
green card?
So if you have a green card, you can get a regular driver's license. It's for people who do not have a permanent residency, right? So without green cards. But yes, thank you.
So no more questions? So thank you, Professor Eva.
Thank you.
So now we are going to give the time to Professor Miguel Ángel. So would you like to stand, to stay there, whatever you want?
Bien, buenos días a todos. Gracias a la Universidad de Notre Dame, a la UPAEP, a la maestra Liz por esta invitación. Y quiero decirles que cuando me invitó para estar en esto, pues pensé en algunos de los trabajos que hemos realizado, pero dije, si los muchachos que vienen de allá quieren saber más de este país, pues les vamos a comentar algunos de los trabajos que hemos hecho en la Universidad Iberoamericana. Por supuesto que hay otros, la maestra Estefanía en su momento les va a dar más pues de estos trabajos. Y por ello es que titulé esta presentación como Facetas y aproximaciones a la migración en Puebla y Nueva York, un recorrido del 2004 al 2023. Bien, no los voy a agobiar dándoles detalles, pero sí una panorámica, ¿no? Nosotros comenzamos en el 2004 estudiando cuál era el efecto de las remesas, es decir, de este dinero que envían los migrantes a sus comunidades. Y queríamos saber qué pasaba no solamente en los hogares, sino en la economía de los lugares donde habitaba la familia que se había quedado en México. Y a través de encuestas armamos lo que se conoce como matrices de contabilidad social. Son unos instrumentos económicos basados en las técnicas del input-output, ¿no? Estas matrices que nos permiten ver cómo circulan los recursos dentro de una economía, cómo pueden llegar a los diferentes sectores, a las familias, por supuesto, y además considerando la economía de esa población pues como parte de una macroeconomía con su sector externo. Y de esa manera pudimos identificar el impacto que tenían, calculamos multiplicadores de gasto para ver qué impacto tenían en los sectores económicos y también en el espacio donde habitaban, dado que no todas las remesas pues se gastaban en el lugar donde recibían el dinero, porque ahí no existía la oferta suficiente. Y de este trabajo, bueno, pues nos dimos cuenta que eran muy importantes, pero que de ninguna manera iban a ser un medio para poder cambiar las estructuras de mala distribución del ingreso en México y de, pues digamos, procesos de empobrecimiento, a menos que fueran de las familias que recibían esas remesas. Ese trabajo también nos permitió distinguir el comportamiento de los hogares que reciben remesas y de los que no reciben remesas. Y se fijaron ahí ciertos parámetros para identificar, por ejemplo, patrones de consumo, que nos permitían ver si efectivamente las remesas cambiaban la forma, por ejemplo, de alimentarse. Y lo que vimos, entre otras cosas, en los resultados que obtuvimos, fue lo siguiente, ahí está, ¿no?, que encontramos en esas comunidades aparatos productivos poco integrados, más orientados hacia los servicios y hacia el comercio, en donde, digamos, no se producía, pero sí se consumía. Y también, por otro lado, vimos que los que ahorraban más eran los hogares que tenían remesas, no obstante que recibían más dinero por un lado, pero también nos dimos cuenta que además de ahorrar, tenían una gran producción de autoconsumo, es decir, que atrás de sus viviendas cultivaban muchos de sus alimentos. Entonces, cosas interesantes como esas nos dejaron ver el impacto de las remesas en sus comunidades y también nos dejó ver estos modelos que armamos, lo importante que era el consumo de los hogares. De ahí la importancia del por qué se van nuestros migrantes hacia los Estados Unidos. Bueno, con este trabajo nos iniciamos en el tema de la migración, precisamente porque queríamos saber qué pasaba con eso. Y entonces hubo la oportunidad de hacer una estancia de investigación allá en la Universidad de la Ciudad de Nueva York, como les comentaba yo hace un momento. Perdón, déjenme decirles que entre otras cosas, fíjense, sacamos información a nivel de encuesta de los hogares, porque esta información no existía, la tuvimos que hacer de encuestas en los hogares. Y por ejemplo, estos son algunos de los datos que obtuvimos. Fíjense ustedes, en una de las gráficas se ve la estructura del ingreso de los hogares y se darán cuenta que en ese entonces estamos hablando del 2006, del 2004, perdón, la mayor proporción del ingreso que recibían los hogares en Tlapanalá, me olvidó decirles que era Tlapanalá, un lugar cercano aquí a Izúcar de Matamoros, era por remesas, es esta barra de color guinda. Y en cuanto a los mercados de trabajo, vimos que la mayor parte de los hogares que no recibían remesas, pues tenían su fuente de trabajo en esa localidad, en tanto que los que recibían remesas, pues la mayoría trabajaba en los Estados Unidos. Y luego otras cosas interesantes, determinamos las estructuras de ingreso, las estructuras de gasto y, como les decía, patrones de consumo. Ya les hablé un poco de esta conclusión en la que las remesas sí ayudan a las familias a alejarse del umbral de la pobreza, pero no cambian las condiciones estructurales de injusticia y de desigualdad social que existen en este país. Algo importante es que la mayor parte de sus recursos en ese entonces los destinaban a la salud, a la vivienda y a ahorrar más. Bien, después de ver eso dijimos, bueno, ¿y cuál es la otra cara de la moneda? ¿No? ¿De dónde vienen las remesas? Y pues nos tuvimos la oportunidad de ir allá a hacer un estudio sobre la economía de los migrantes en Nueva York. Y fue algo interesante porque, como les mencionaba yo en una de las intervenciones anteriores, me tocó vivir con los migrantes y además entrevistar pues a varios de los migrantes. Anduve prácticamente por los 5 condados de la ciudad de Nueva York, subiendo, bajando, entrevistando, en el trabajo, en sus casas, y sacamos datos muy interesantes, como estos. No les quiero abrumar, pero por ejemplo, el tiempo de trabajo promedio era de 60 horas a la semana. Los hombres en promedio 61 horas y las mujeres 57 horas de trabajo. El pago por hora o por semana se dividía así, por hora, prácticamente era por hora, ¿verdad? Desde $5 hasta $28. Los hombres ganaban en promedio a la semana $779 y las mujeres 569. Quiero decirles que aquí pues la muestra fue por conveniencia, ¿no?, de los que nos encontrábamos, porque era más complicado andarlos sacando al azar, andarlos obteniendo al azar. El ingreso anual promedio de los hombres era de $40,484 y de las mujeres de $29,588 al año. Y en ese entonces, pues el 80% de los hombres vivía por arriba de la línea de pobreza establecida en los Estados Unidos, en tanto que las mujeres solo el 62%. Y bueno, miren, estos son datos muy interesantes porque nos aproximaron a cómo destinaban su ingreso precisamente los migrantes. Si logran distinguir ahí la área que es, digamos, como de un lila muy, muy tenue, corresponde en el 21% al ahorro. El azul más fuerte son remesas. Observen ustedes cómo esa cantidad, que casi es la mitad del ingreso, la ahorran y parte de esa la envían a México. Pero no crean ustedes que porque ganan mucho, sino porque se sacrifican demasiado. No sé si ustedes sepan, pero la mayoría de ellos viven en una casa de manera colectiva. Puede haber hogares que yo visité, por ejemplo, en donde había 4 habitaciones y vivían 21 personas. Esas 21 personas, bueno, ¿qué le permitían al migrante? Poder pagar una renta muy alta, pero que en conjunto se diluía y terminaban pagando $100 al mes. Pero esa casa era de más de $2,500. Fíjense. Entonces, eso pues va en detrimento justamente de su bienestar, de su calidad de vida allá. ¿Pero para qué? Para que pudieran ahorrar y enviar remesas acá, a México, a sus familiares. Observen ustedes, hay un 14%, eso es lo que destinaban a la alimentación, fíjense, y la otra parte a la renta, porque no dejaba de ser un gasto importante. Y en la parte de abajo ya no les digo más, es más o menos la misma proporción, pero ahora de los gastos. Entonces, al final, ¿qué es lo que nosotros vimos? Que el ahorro que ellos tenían lo destinaban en México a construir casa, ahí está, en un 36%, luego en un 17% intentaban iniciar un negocio y un 8% trabajaba para retirarse. Quiero decirles que sin excepción, a todos los que yo entrevisté terminaron diciéndome, yo quiero regresar a México. O sea, no tenían pensado quedarse en los Estados Unidos. Esta es su tierra. Bueno, como una reflexión final de este trabajo, pues podemos decir que la mayoría de los migrantes son buenos administradores, aunque sacrifican, ¿verdad?, gran parte de su bienestar, pero ahorran y envían remesas. Y pues son capaces de hacer muchos de los trabajos que otros no quieren hacer, pero que eso les permite poder enviar remesas, aunque allá viven como pobres. Eso es muy importante. Y siempre están con la esperanza de poder regresar. Les repito, ninguno me dijo que se quería regresar en ese entonces. Bueno, aquí hay unas fotografías ahí de Nueva York, para que vean cómo andan por ahí circulando. Hay muchísimos en Nueva York. Me tocó entrevistar a los que les había ido muy bien, tenían negocios y negocios prósperos, ya con papeles, ya ciudadanos norteamericanos, pero que seguían viniendo, es más, siguen viniendo a México. De hecho, mi vecino es uno de esos, que viene a México porque tiene papeles y porque tiene cantidad de propiedades aquí en México, por ejemplo, ¿no? Hay otros a los que les fue regular, ¿verdad?, pero siguen yendo y viniendo con papeles, y hay otros que no les fue bien, y podría yo agregar un cuarto grupo, que son los que no aguantan y se regresan sin cumplir sus metas allá. Bien, pero pues me regresaron, un día me dijeron, ya no puedes estar allá en Nueva York, hay que regresarse a la universidad. Me llamaron de la universidad, no me deportaron, me regresaron de la universidad. Y yo me preguntaba, bueno, aquí en México lo que hemos hecho han sido muchos estudios de caso, y principalmente estudios no hechos por economistas, sino hechos por sociólogos, por antropólogos, por historiadores, y qué bueno, pero han sido estudios de caso. Y yo me preguntaba, ¿y qué pasa, por ejemplo, en el estado de Puebla? No sé si ustedes sepan, pero el estado de Puebla tiene 217 municipios. Y estos 217 municipios forman parte de un conjunto que se llama el Estado de Puebla. Y la pregunta era, ¿y qué está pasando en el Estado de Puebla con la migración? Y nos pusimos a hacer una base de datos a nivel municipal con todos los datos allegados desde la demografía, por supuesto, los estados de bienestar, la pobreza, la migración y demás. Pero en el camino nos encontramos algunos colegas que se dedicaban al estudio del medio ambiente y del cambio climático. Y siempre con la idea de hacer cosas diferentes, distintas, hoy dirían innovadoras, pues les propusimos hacer algo relacionado con el medio ambiente, es decir, la migración, el medio ambiente y el bienestar de las personas. Y lo que hicimos fue pues tratar de buscar variables, ¿verdad?, que nos permitieran hacer esto, y armamos unos modelos, esos que acostumbramos los economistas, ¿no?, unas regresiones y demás, pero la verdad es que cuando tratamos de poner variables que tuvieran que ver con el cambio climático, medido por el cambio de temperatura y por las variaciones pluviales, pues nos vimos en el problema de que no teníamos esa información. Y entonces, aunque hicimos esas regresiones y nos salieron algunas relaciones importantes, lo que hicimos fue recurrir a un análisis gráfico espacial, y comenzamos haciendo esto. Miren ustedes, este es el mapa del estado de Puebla. Ustedes ahí no se distingue para ustedes mucho, pero está dividido en los 217 municipios. Esas franjas de color amarillo, naranja, rojo y rojo encendido representan precisamente las variaciones climáticas que se esperaban para el 2020, este trabajo se hizo en el 2014, era lo que se esperaba para el 2020 en términos de efectos del cambio climático de acuerdo a los escenarios del panel intergubernamental de cambio climático. Son aproximaciones de cuáles iban a ser los efectos. Y lo que hicimos fue entonces cartografiar las variables de marginación, de marginación, y ustedes se podrán dar cuenta ahí en un mapa que está ya junto, donde aparecen ya los municipios con tonalidades. Entonces, cartografiamos la migración y cartografiamos también la emigración internacional y la calificamos. Y lo que están ustedes viendo del lado derecho es un mapa en donde están las isoclimas, estas del cambio climático, con las calificaciones de emigración, de la migración internacional, para cada uno de los municipios. Entonces, si ustedes observan el mapa, se darán cuenta en la parte de abajo, no sé, ¿tiene láser? No. Bueno, las partes rojas, esas partes rojas son las donde iba a impactar el cambio climático fuerte y muy fuerte en la parte del rojo encendido. La parte del rojo encendido es la que corresponde a esta área, que es la región de Angelópolis. Y la parte de abajo, toda esa parte rojiza, es una parte que tiene que ver con la Mixteca poblana, donde son altos los índices de migración y de intensidad migratoria. Entonces, bueno, esto fue lo que estuvimos haciendo, y aquí tienen ustedes los mapas. Fíjense, el primero es del 2000 y el otro es del 2010, perdón, en donde ustedes se pueden dar cuenta cómo estaba el mapa en el 2010 en una gran proporción blanca en términos de la emigración, de los que salieron hacia los Estados Unidos, y cómo estaba en el 2010. Vean la cantidad de personas que habían salido de Puebla. Bueno, esto nos permitió entonces tener ya una panorámica de lo que estaba pasando y además ligarlo a variaciones del cambio climático, que era un ejercicio que por lo menos no se había hecho para México en estas condiciones. ¿Qué fue lo que sucedió? Como no tenemos muchos recursos para abrir diferentes líneas de investigación, entonces lo que vamos haciendo es saltando de proyecto, de tema en tema, para poder pues ir viendo lo que está sucediendo. Y cuando estuvimos estudiando esto nos dimos cuenta que no habían salido tantos como los que habían entrado a Puebla, es decir, migrantes de retorno. Y entonces el siguiente trabajo que hicimos fue precisamente hacia los migrantes de retorno. E hicimos algunos trabajos, quise dejar por la leyenda que tiene, dice: ya llegué, pero me quiero regresar. El difícil proceso de reintegración de los migrantes de retorno en Puebla. Y esto nuevamente nos llevó a tener que hacer encuestas en 6 municipios a migrantes de retorno. Y créanme que es sumamente difícil. ¿Por qué? Porque no es tan sencillo como llegar con una persona que ha emigrado y que le ha ido bien y que quiere hablar y que quiere decir eso que le ha ido bien a una persona que retorna. Y si no cumplió con sus expectativas, incluso en la comunidad lo señalan como una persona frustrada y una persona fracasada. Y no se diga si lo deportaron, peor tantito, lo estigmatizan y lo ven como algo fracasado en la comunidad. Entonces es muy difícil. No obstante, llegamos a levantar 400 encuestas en 6 municipios del estado de Puebla para tener al menos una fotografía de lo que estaba sucediendo con estos migrantes. E hicimos varios trabajos. Aquí hay uno que tiene que ver con la migración de retorno y la reinserción económica y vulnerabilidad en la periferia globalizada, un caso de Puebla. Y aquí, fíjense, nos referimos a un municipio que está pegado aquí a Puebla y que yo lo seleccioné porque es un municipio muy importante, es donde está la Volkswagen, fíjense. La Volkswagen, que es una empresa que se supone es de la globalización, abre trabajos para muchas personas, con los salarios más altos en Puebla y demás. ¿Y qué sucedía en ese municipio? Bueno, pues encontramos varias cosas. Miren, ahí está el mapa de México, ahí está Puebla y ahí está el municipio de Cuautlancingo, el que está ahí medio grisecito dentro del área morada. Bien. ¿Qué fue lo que hicimos? Bueno, pues preguntarles qué hicieron con sus remesas que enviaron y qué hicieron con el ahorro. Y efectivamente la mayoría lo invirtió en poner un negocio y la mayoría trató de desarrollar actividades por su cuenta, por ejemplo, ¿no? Pero ¿qué había pasado en esas actividades por su cuenta? muchos de ellos se dedicaban al comercio, pero no era porque hubieran puesto una tienda o que hubieran puesto un negocio así en grande, no, muchos se dedicaban al comercio informal y otros habían conseguido trabajos pero muy precarios en términos del salario y de sus condiciones laborales. Entonces se darán cuenta cómo se estaba formando, ¿verdad?, su pensamiento ya estando de regreso en México. Y para ello, bueno, igual hicimos algunas mediciones. Los economistas no dejamos de medir, ¿verdad? Y como dicen, pues lo que se mide se puede mejorar, y entonces hicimos algunos constructos, ¿no? Uno de movilidad laboral sectorial para ver a qué se habían dedicado antes de irse, a qué se dedicaron en Estados Unidos y a qué se estaban dedicando cuando regresaron. Y antes había una gran proporción de gente en el campo, en Estados Unidos fueron empleados y cuando regresaron estaban entre obreros, empleados y una actividad por su cuenta. El segundo constructo fue de movilidad ocupacional para ver qué tipo de trabajo en términos de su simplicidad o su complejidad. Y vimos que aquí pues era un trabajo muy simple, en los Estados Unidos era pues digamos simple porque eran como empleados de actividades muy sencillas. Ustedes saben que ahí se ocupaban en los restaurantes, en la construcción, en el comercio y demás, en el campo, pero cuando regresaban acá volvían prácticamente a hacer el mismo tipo de trabajo. Sin embargo, también medimos los salarios que recibían, el ingreso que recibían antes de irse en Estados Unidos y cuando regresaron. Y vimos que hubo ahí cierta movilidad. ¿Por qué? Porque del grupo que ganaba antes de irse menos de un salario mínimo, prácticamente se desplazan hacia 1, 3 salarios, 3 y 5 salarios, es decir, hubo una mejoría, pero digamos que también muy limitada, ¿verdad? Y el último de los constructos que hicimos fue la posición en el trabajo, que era, bueno, ¿qué puesto ocupaban antes de irse, estando allá y cuando regresaron? Y cuando se fueron de aquí, bueno, pues eran empleados y eran jornaleros, en Estados Unidos eran empleados, y cuando regresaron, pues ya eran trabajadores por su cuenta, es decir, había una movilidad, pero no en todos los casos una mejoría que se reflejaba en sus condiciones laborales de trabajo satisfactoriamente, porque sí, eran trabajadores por su cuenta, pero ya les decía yo, no todos con buenos empleos. Bien. Les preguntamos, oiga, ¿y qué es necesario para que usted mejore? Y aquí están las respuestas. Decían, bueno, fundamentalmente que haya empleos bien remunerados. Y cuando les preguntábamos, ¿y cuáles son los obstáculos? Bueno, nos hablaban de obstáculos, primero económico, ¿no? El primero es que no tenemos empleos con suficiente remuneración y el diferencial salarial era determinante. Más o menos, personas que en el campo aquí ganaban cierta cantidad, allá llegando ganan 10 veces más, así, sencillo, ¿no? Las que trabajan en el campo, no es para todos, no es para todos los niveles. Y la otra era condiciones ya que tienen que ver con el bienestar. Ahí ustedes se podrán dar cuenta que había, digamos que inconformidades, ¿por qué? Por el clima, porque no hablaban el idioma. O sea, traían hijos que hablaban solo inglés, que habían estudiado allá y cuando llegan acá, pues aquí no hay escuelas bilingües, ¿verdad? Y también que no eran siempre bien acogidos por las comunidades. Entonces vean ustedes cómo se van porque aquí no hay condiciones buenas, están allá cuidándose de que no los vayan a perseguir y regresan acá y bueno, si traen dinero les va muy bien y si no, se ven con problemas. No es tan sencilla la vida de nuestros migrantes, es realmente muy compleja. Pero miren ustedes, ¿qué esperaban? Y esto es lo interesante. La mayoría planeaba adquirir bienes raíces y o establecer un negocio, como lo dijimos con su ahorro. Pero también la mayoría, como regresó sin cumplir sus metas, se sentía frustrado. 53% de las mujeres y 45% de los hombres planeaban regresar a los Estados Unidos. Y aquí, bueno, ya no puse otra cifra, pero el 75% aspiraba a que sus hijos fueran a estudiar y a vivir a los Estados Unidos. Vean ustedes las condiciones y los efectos que tiene la migración. Bueno, después de este trabajo, bueno, aquí hicimos otro de retorno y cambio climático, nos dimos a la tarea de ver, bueno, ¿y qué estaba pasando con estos retornados? Y resulta que nos metimos al tema de la salud y de la migración de retorno. ¿Por qué? Porque asumimos que los migrantes que se van son seleccionados por las familias como los mejores para ir a la migración, los más sanos. E incluso en Estados Unidos se hicieron estudios comparando la salud de nativos con los migrantes, y nuestros migrantes eran más sanos que los nativos de allá. Pero no porque fueran precisamente más sanos allá, sino porque iban los seleccionados de acá para poder aguantar la migración. Y ustedes pueden revisarlo, esos son estudios que se han hecho allá en Estados Unidos, ¿no? Es el famoso, el famoso efecto del migrante saludable. Bueno, pero ¿qué es lo que sucede cuando llegan allá? Desde que parten, tan solo en la pasada comienzan a tener ya serios problemas de salud. ¿Por qué? Por la tensión, por el estrés. Ustedes saben que la pasada hacia los Estados Unidos, además de ser muy costosa, es muy peligrosa. Y además de eso, pues tienen también enfermedades en el camino, ¿no? Sobre todo de carácter de infecciones intestinales y de efectos en el sistema nervioso por el miedo, por el temor a ser atrapados. Llegando allá, los que llegan, ¿verdad?, también están sometidos a un ritmo de vida muy fuerte, a un cambio de alimentación, y eso, pues al principio no les da mella. ¿Por qué? Porque pues van los más fuertes, pero conforme va pasando el tiempo, la salud se va menguando. ¿Y qué es lo que sucede? Que al cambiar de dieta, ustedes saben que la dieta en Estados Unidos es muy rica en carbohidratos y grasas. ¿Y qué es lo que pasa con nuestros migrantes? Después de ser aquí gente muy activa, que sale y entra, allá salen y entran, pero los que no cuentan con documentos, los fines de semana no salen por temor a que les pueda pasar algo. Y entonces ese sedentarismo los lleva a subir de peso, los lleva a comenzar a tener problemas de obesidad y después problemas de diabetes y problemas de hipertensión. Y pasa el tiempo, van envejeciendo o van haciéndose más grandes y comienzan a tener problemas cada vez más fuertes. Y ustedes saben que los gastos médicos en los Estados Unidos son muy altos y no siempre logran tener la mejor atención. De hecho, recurren a sistemas de cura muy sui generis. Por ejemplo, les llaman a los parientes en México para decirles que les manden algo o que les receten algo. Y lo primero que hacen es automedicarse con tés, es decir, con hierbas, para poder estar allá y no gastar y no ir a un hospital donde ellos creen que les pueden atrapar o capturar. Fíjense. Otros, los que pueden, se hacen, le llaman al pariente aquí en México y lo mandan con un doctor para que vaya y le diga los síntomas, se haga pasar por el inmigrante. Entonces le dice que pues los síntomas lo recetan y de aquí le mandan las medicinas. Y así pueden ir viendo diferentes estrategias que tienen para curarse, hasta el que llega a la frontera cuando ya la situación es muy difícil, va y se opera en la frontera, pero que tiende a regresar, en fin. Entonces, ¿cuál era nuestra propuesta a partir de esto? Que el tema de la salud de los migrantes de retorno y de los migrantes en general es que debe verse como un problema binacional. ¿Por qué? Porque nuestros migrantes se van sanos y no regresan sanos los que regresan enfermos, y debería de haber una corresponsabilidad de los dos países. Bueno, de ahí saltamos al tema, aquí son gráficas que tienen que ver con la salud de los migrantes, y de ahí saltamos, pues viene la pandemia, hay que entrarle a la pandemia, ¿verdad? Y hay que entrarle también al tema de la vejez, porque ustedes sabrán que en los próximos 5 años va a haber más gente mayor en México, y nos pusimos a ver los migrantes de retorno, la vejez y la pandemia. Y pues nos dimos cuenta que efectivamente tiene que haber políticas encaminadas, orientadas a atender a los migrantes de retorno mayores, porque ya tenemos pues varios o bastantes migrantes mayores que no cuentan con una pensión y que no todos viven bien. De ahí el desarrollo de iniciativas y de programas enfocados para la salud de los migrantes. Bueno, como se darán cuenta, hemos ido dando saltos porque vamos viendo cómo va la realidad demandándonos, ¿verdad? Cosas que tenemos que estudiar, y si tuviéramos un centro de investigación, pues ponemos a unos a hacer una cosa y a otros otra y a otros otra, en fin. Pero bueno, así es como vamos caminando. Y bueno, finalmente regresamos nuevamente prácticamente 8 años después a preguntarnos ¿y qué está pasando en Puebla? ¿Verdad? Después de esos estudios que hicimos, solo que ahora estamos estudiando la migración, las remesas y el desarrollo regional, queremos ver los impactos, pero hemos agregado ya variables políticas y variables ambientales, y eso es lo que estamos trabajando desde el año pasado. Los subproductos que tenemos como marco de contexto es un trabajo que el año pasado, a invitación del doctor Alfredo, que aquí nos acompaña, a un evento, bueno, pues lo presentamos. Es un trabajo sobre crecimiento y distribución de la migración y de las remesas en México, utilizando un método de análisis que se utiliza en economía del desarrollo, el Shift Share Analysis, ¿no? Para poder ver qué es lo que pasa con las remesas que llegan a México. De eso no les quiero aburrir, lo único que les quiero decir es que es un método que nos permite ver cuáles son los componentes que hacen que lleguen las remesas a un determinado lugar. Y como lo hicimos para México, pues lo hicimos para las 32 entidades, los 32 estados de la República. E identificamos cosas muy interesantes, porque este método de análisis nos permitió descomponer lo que pasó con las remesas antes de la pandemia, es decir, del 2010 al 2019, y luego del 2020 y 21. Y de ahí sacamos algunas cosas interesantes, ¿no? Como son estas conclusiones, y ya es lo último para no seguirles abrumando. Entre 2010 y 2020 la inmigración disminuyó. Sin embargo, desde 2014 las remesas hacia México aumentaron enormemente. Eso es de todos los días noticias en México. Bien, el crecimiento y la distribución de las remesas a nivel de los estados de la República, descompuesto en esos 3 componentes, tuvo su mayor influencia a partir del dinamismo de los mexicanos en los Estados Unidos. Ese fue el componente que nosotros denominamos como nacional. También tuvo una influencia del dinamismo de las remesas que pagan los Estados Unidos al mundo. Ese le denominamos el componente de Estados Unidos. Y finalmente, calculamos el componente de la región, que es el que tiene que ver con lo que hace la región para atraer remesas. Sin embargo, no debemos de olvidar que las regiones o los lugares no hacen por atraer remesas, sino más bien las reciben, que es diferente. Y eso es algo muy interesante a investigar. Y es precisamente ahí donde estamos, es a donde vamos a entrar, y ya estamos trabajando este análisis para los municipios de Puebla y para las regiones de Puebla. Porque queremos saber, primero, por qué han estado creciendo tanto las remesas. Segundo, el efecto que ha tenido la migración y las remesas en los municipios y en las regiones de este estado. Y también nos dimos cuenta que surgieron muchísimas preguntas a partir de este trabajo a nivel nacional, y que esperemos que haya personas que decidan entrar a eso, o nosotros con nuestros alumnos también entrarle, porque el tema de las remesas va a ser crucial, es crucial y va a ser crucial en los próximos años. Muchas gracias. Esto es lo que les quería compartir.
Okay, so I'll share a little bit from all the different portraits that Miguel gave us. And I would like to say that from what Miguel shows on the different research that they have done, all those findings, it's the importance of understanding circular migration in the Mixteca region in Puebla, which is 1.5 hours from here, from Puebla. And so this is an area when they have been working not only here in the communities but also in New York, because that's the circuit, the migration circuit that they do. So they go from Tlapanalá, Huaquechula, right? From those two.
Yes.
And they go to New York and New Jersey. So part of what I think is really important to understand is how circular migration is surrounded around remittances, but also all the different cultural components and social components. Something that he shared, it's how, and I know they're going to share later on about remittances again, but it's how remittances just bring more than just the savings and improving housing. It goes beyond that. And why? Because it also brings them another type of social status, which is a very important thing and cultural sensitive for these communities. So something that I think also is remarkable to understand, it's how, and Miguel said that they migrate, but when they arrive to New York, when one of the examples that he gave, it's having 22 people living in one house, because in that way they spend less money in rent, but that's the way that they have to live. So they live in poverty. They don't have, some of the fines is like 60 hours per week that they work, but also they have a shared space with other 20 people in one apartment, in one house. And all the savings that they have goes for building a house. That's kind of the most common that in the different findings. It's building a house, but also start thinking about a business. It's, kind of be a little bit entrepreneurs and do a business. So when they come back, because that's the other thing about this circular migration, they all think about returning. And with the different fundings is that living in this poverty allows them to send more remittances. So more money will come here. From these different stats that he gave, 36% goes for building a house. And if you go to these communities, and I know this time you have a really tight schedule, but maybe if you kind of go, we have different pictures. You could see the different type of houses that they will do in these communities, and you will know right away they are from migrants that are sending this money to build these houses. We're talking about 2-3 floors of houses. So it's 36%, which means 1/3 of their income from the US will go to build a house. And also 17% will go for starting a business in Mexico. 8% will only go for retirement, if they kind of have that 8%. So something that I think also it's important, and I will talk about that later on, it's they only spend 3% on health. And that's something that they found now in this recent research that they had done after COVID. And also another important thing is how climate change has also made an impact on migration. So when they did all this portrait about how the different of rain and the density of the communities also will have them migrate more often. And from 2004, when you did it, and then 2010?
No, 2010 a
2010 to 2010 to 2020, it shows a big impact on climate change. And then another important thing, it's like the people that will migrate from here are maybe farmers or agricultural workers here, and they will go and be on any type of labor. It will be factory, gardening, or different types of works in US. And then there will be returnees. And that's the other important thing about that area. It's, yeah, so that one. It's how they use all those savings and all remittances. If they were able to build that business here, they will be a businessman when they come back. How long would last the business? That's something that they haven't figured out late now, because it started becoming more often these returnees, volunteer returnees, but that brings another social impact that he said, that it's like they feel like they have frustration, but also like a failure, because they're failing to have more of what they were expecting to have when they went for the very first time to US. And just for another closing, it's this very last research that they are doing regarding seniors after COVID. And there were many people that returned to Puebla or to this area, to Mixteca, and they didn't have any funding, they didn't have any retirement. And something that I think it really impacted me is when these migrants went from Mixteca, from this Mixteca region to New York, they were healthy, young people, and now that they're returning, either it's returning for like volunteering for returning or deportation, which is even a bigger stigma for the communities. It's that they don't have any other health insurance or medical resources for attending themselves here. So we're talking about returnees that are over 60 years that they don't have any good health, they can't work anymore, and they don't have any savings for retirement. They might have a really big house, maybe some of them might have that business, but they don't have the health to work on that business or to even have another job to continue improving their lives. So I think I tried to wrap most of it.
So Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. So I have in Spanish, but I'll do it in English. Okay. So we have heard about different risks and behaviors from our immigrant community in the US, but also what happens here in Mexico. So I'm just going to go back and forward on this presentation, which is not only it's going to be about talking migrants and mobility from Central America to US, but also the ones that are already in the US. And what I think is really important that we could get through this, it's because there's lack of health services in Mexico for all those Central Americans that are trying to cross the border to US, but also from all these undocumented migrants that are already in the US. So before pandemic times, there was a different story regarding health services in Mexico for Central Americans migrants. But what is really important to understand is how difficult it was during COVID times for getting any type of services. For Central Americans here in Mexico, they weren't allowed to be in shelters, and I know some of you will visit one tomorrow. So because we were really restricted on getting with other people, they couldn't be entering to refuges or shelters. And what happened is most of the Central Americans were staying outside of the shelters, and they will just bring them food or other type of services. But if they got COVID, they weren't also receiving these medical services, as we weren't neither. I mean, talking about Mexicans. And the same thing was happening in the US when, and they were already sharing before, Miguel and Eva, it's health insurance. And the other thing is in New York, when it started all this first peak of the pandemics, it was that they were all essential workers. And California also with all these farm workers. So they were getting sick and they couldn't get any of these services. And the other thing, and I'm kind of closing with remittances, they wanted to still send in money because they were the very first source of income for people here or their families. So what happened in these conditions is that we still lived 3 years of pandemics and nothing changed. It kind of worsened the situation for migrants. And again, I'm talking about mobility because now we have here in Mexico this phenomenon where we're having more and more Central Americans and Latin Americans from Venezuela also that are staying in Mexico with their families, and they don't have any healthcare access. So that's talking about healthcare access with health issues. But there's the other part that we really lack on, which is mental health. And less we're really working on doing something around. So I have 3 different spheres that I call. There is attention. And I'm more including all these different nonprofit organizations and all the different specific scenarios when they could get or not their health access. So from this first sphere, we're talking about the government and all the different public institutions that should be the ones giving this access for healthcare. And here in Mexico, we do have the public health, which it's overcrowded, and if we have a Central American, even they have to get free access for services, they don't get it. Because there's a lack of information about if they are allowed to have or not receiving these type of services. And I'm just going to give you a quick example. 3 weeks ago, there was this bus that was carrying or bringing Central Americans and people from Venezuela to going to the border. They have a really bad car accident and they crashed. There were 40 people in that bus. 18 died, and the other ones have to go to a public hospital in Tehuacan, which is 2 hours from here. And from those, they were receiving healthcare, but they didn't have the medicine for given to them. So that's what the other sphere will come. The second sphere, which is social programs or nonprofits or just regular people that will fund those medicines for these people. So we're talking about that some of them might receive medical attention, and it's also related with media. If the crash wasn't that media intense as it was, maybe the small towns wouldn't have them allowed in the hospital. So that's one type of example about how the government should be the one giving this very first response for healthcare here in Mexico. And in US, as you know, there's the public hospitals or the Cook or the county hospitals or the city public clinics, but the same thing, they aren't really allowing them to arrive, and because of their status, they don't want to go neither to those places. And something also that it's been interesting with Mexico is in, before you were talking about matricula consular, which is all these different type of services that the consulate will give to their nationals in the U.S. So with the Mexican consulates in the U.S., there is this, it's called Ventanilla de Salud, which is now these new offices that they have bring to the consulates when they will provide some health information, some the immunizations with COVID. That was one of the first places when they will have the immunizations of the vaccines for immigrants, for undocumented people. But there aren't as many consulates as we would like to have in every single city in the U.S. And also, there are these different campaigns here in Mexico, and I will share a little bit. They're giving more and more campaigns to prevent health. And again, I'm just talking about health for all these people that are just crossing the border and they have like deshydratation, but that they also are having like sunburn or they have like sore arms, foot or feet. And so that's another type of different health that it's provided or health services. And also here in Mexico, as it is in the U.S., parishes and church are the ones that also bring these other health services that are provided by the government. So here we have the local shelters, the one that you will visit tomorrow. It's faith-based. Let's say it's from Catholic Church, that it's the one providing. So what happened in this example that I give you from this bus accident in Tehuacan, the ones that came first to help at the hospital, at the public hospital, were these groups from parishes, parishioners that will just go and provide any type of aid that they might need. Same thing happened in the US when we have different nonprofits that join parishes and they might have health fairs when they will provide some of these services. So it's kind of what the other sector is doing to kind of help a little bit on these needs that they might be related with health. And the very last one, it's the third sphere, which talks about institutions or educational institutes like universities, the one that we are here today, that we just try to go and do some research that might help with other policies and that we could improve and just bring more information regarding health. So there are resources, yes, but they're limited. And for nonprofits, there's the one that we work a lot with Ibero. It's what else can we provide? Because we have volunteers. Most of these nonprofits are just run by volunteers here, and same thing with US. Although in US, they have a little bit more of funding when they might have people that it's already employed, but it doesn't mean that they have plenty of funding. And as you know, it depends on the federal or the state government, and if they have cuts, the very first cut will go to this type of programs. And we have joint efforts, and again, I'm gonna just bring this example from the shelter because it will just help you for tomorrow. You're bringing in some medicine and other things that they need, and no one else could cover those. And this is the very first part that this aid will help. As they've been going, the Central Americans might have left their countries 3-4 weeks, 1 month, 2 months, and they've been suffering already through the very half or their trip because they still have another half before even trying to cross the border. So this is part of what we've been doing from Ibero. How can we just partner with others? So here, in these different ways that we do it, from Ibero, we have this program where we have our students going to US. We have right now students in Chicago and New York, but also we have students in the border. So they will just bring some aid, some cultural sensitive information that could help to bring more information regarding what could they access and what they can't, which is also really important because as we have the example of the driver's license, it happens the same with the medical, and most of them might not have medical insurance, even if they already work in the US. And I will talk a little bit that later on. But so I could see like 3 different strategies that need to be done for this type of work. And the first one is public health. And what is happening here in Mexico is we're getting more and more people staying longer in some cities. So we have the south border, which is Tapachula, Chiapas. We have thousands of families living there, waiting for a response to see if they could migrate and cross the border or cross the country to get to the north side border. And in the last months, they have seen more and more infections. And one of those were COVID in the past years, but also, and it's really, really getting a concern for healthcare, is malaria and other diseases that are growing in these areas that we haven't seen before in a long time in our country, but because they're getting more migrants from all different countries, there's in the past months they're receiving more African migrants. So and because they live, kind of that same example of the 20 people living in one house, here we're talking about hundreds of people living in tents in a public park. So that's another thing that it's a joint effort between government, church, and nonprofits when they are bringing these services, and they're doing a lot of campaigns so they have more information about this. They're doing tests, malaria tests, COVID, HIV, and HIV is something that goes beyond all borders because there's this, and I will take this example from the circular migration. There are more and more often different relations or extramarital relations that are also giving this type of infections. So if we have someone that is living in the US and have different partners there, plus their wife here in Mexico, and they're doing this circular migration, there's a high risk that they will get infected here. And if she's pregnant, then she's already having an extra 3rd or 4th person. So in the 90s, late 90s, there was a big problem in the consulate in Chicago when they had this concern about a small community here in Mexico. There was a growth, like a really, really strong growth of cases of HIV patients. So they kind of go through the different network to see what was going on, and they found out that there was this woman that was a partner of so many different in Chicago. So they were only infected the woman, and then all the different guys that she was doing prostitution, and how then they came back and infect a lot of their wives and relatives here in Mexico. So that's another big problem that hasn't really been taken. Even, and you could see if you go to different health fairs in the US, when they do have HIV tests. And that's another way to kind of prevent more contagious. And the other thing is the lack of access to food. So here in Mexico, if they don't work, they're not gonna get food. If they don't go to a shelter, they're not gonna get any food. So they might have to be looking in the trash or asking for some food. But now we're talking about a big problem of nutrition. Most for this, there are families that are coming with little children, 2 years, 3 years, or even pregnant. So we're talking about another high risk. And also water. They're not gonna find clean water here as they're going to their journey and traveling to the border. So that's another big risk. And the physical risk of getting into a train, getting to a bus, going through the desert, that's an extra different type of health risk. So what we're trying to do is work more with prevention, which is what we really lack in Mexico. And Miguel put an example of how long they will wait, or how they're going to ask for someone to get information about a doctor because they don't have money to spend for a doctor. And that's the same with Central Americans and with undocumented migrants in the US. So we're trying to see, and part of what some of the programs that we have is we have nutrition students that will go to some of these nonprofits in the US and bring information regarding health habits for children. We can't do so much with the workers because they have a different schedule. They will eat whatever they could find in the factory, and they will do the fast food because that's what they could afford. But we're talking about their children. But the lack there, it's about food deserts. If they're living in a community that they might only have a small grocery store in a corner, we have one student that was like really in shock when she found out that the little kid, I think was like 7 years old, he had no idea what were the strawberries and the blueberries because those are expensive and they can't afford those. So that's another effort that we have to look forward. It's even if we want to give them like this really nice health plan, they can't afford it. And the other one is also important regarding pregnancy. There's a big rate of pregnancy that is happening through the for Central Americans as they're crossing the border, and that has to do with sexual abuse. So most of them now are bringing their own conception pills to prevent that they will get pregnant through this abuse. And also to the same thing with the undocumented when they're already in the US, because we're talking about having to invest more money as they're having more children. And the very last one, which is the healthcare, which is the one that we see the less. And I say that it is the less that we work with, because here in Mexico, and you will see in the shelter, there's people that will just spend 1 night or 2 nights. You can't make this strong link when they will share it with you what is going through their minds. So it's really hard to provide some health services here because it's people in mobility, and we don't have enough time to provide some first aid psychological services. And then the whole trauma of going through to crossing the border will bring that trauma when they're already settled in the US. And that is something that we also want to work with. So we have a couple of good programs that we work with also in the US when we provide some of these healthcare, but more like emotional care for some migrants that have maybe they have already 5-10 years already in the US, and that's something else that we do parishes. So we have some psychology students that will go to Chicago, and now we have it in New York. They will work with Mexican women, and they will just talk because we can do counseling. But at least they will talk, and they feel really comfy talking with someone from their own country that will understand them what they're going through. So that's something that we still need to work. And then the other thing is there aren't any resources for mental health. And I know that's a big issue also in the US, not only for undocumented, overall. And the same here, it's like we'll just do basic needs, but no one really wants to fund mental care. So and before going to that one, I just want to give you another example. So there's this story that came out this weekend from Telemundo, which is one of the TV news anchor from US, from Latinos. And there was this story, and I will send it to Lisette, and she could share it with you. It's in Spanish, but it shows the reality of undocumented migrants. And she's from Puebla, nearby, like 2 hours from here, from Chignahuapan, and that you might go a little bit through when you go to Ciudad Cerdán. So she's 20 now, I think 27 years, but she was 25 when she was driving through her work in a factory really early in the morning. It was snowy, which is another of the concerns about weather. and she had a car accident. She can walk now, and she have a debt of over $200,000 because she didn't have any medical insurance. She had a baby of 2 years old that she needs to take care of, and she needs to still she needs to pay that bill. Why? Because she knows that if she doesn't pay that bill, maybe later on when she wants to work on her regularization and do her residency or permanent or something regarding her status, she have a debt. So there's no way that she can pay the $200,000 without a job, because of course she now can work. So what she did is she came back to Mexico to have her family network here and try to provide some input and a little bit of income from her family here. But she still needs therapists, and she can't find them here even that she's a Mexican citizen. So this reality that we have with migrants is the same of lack of information that they have for getting services. So here, what we try to do with migrants, with undocumented migrants that are crossing, most of them are from Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Venezuela, is to tell them that they could go to a public clinic or hospital. The thing is that they're not gonna get their access for health right away, because they have this stigma from the people that work here. They would say, no, I can't take care of you because you're immigrant, undocumented, so we can't take you. So that's what we have here in Mexico, in some of the shelters that are in Veracruz. It's Médicos Sin Fronteras, which is Doctors Without Borders. They are the ones that will come, have like sometimes in different shelters, and provide some of this help. But we don't have also that in the US, and it's really hard for telling people to approach to different nonprofits and understand that they might have a little bit of funding or some programs that will give them medicine. And so that's why I'm bringing back these findings from Miguel, when it was only 3% that people will take from their income for health. And it's getting a bigger problem because I work pretty close with Catholic Charities in Chicago, and we have Health First during the summer. We attend 500 people, all of them undocumented, during the summer, in one day. In one day, we had 500 people. We knew that they were undocumented. We always try to cite the health fair in a parish, so they will feel really confident about going in a trusty space. And people will arrive with their foot already sore, but not because of walking, because of diabetes or other types of diseases that they have, like chronic diseases. So that's another thing that by the time they will try to find health care, it might be already too late. So we're talking about another way when this is the person that will bring the income, not only for their families in the US, but also from their families in Mexico. So if one of them will get sick, we're losing two different incomes. The one that will stay in the US and the one that needs to be sent to Mexico. And some of them know how to navigate, how to understand that they could get some of these, that they will have to pay, which is the other story. Here in Mexico, we really use that if you go to a public healthcare clinic or something, you don't have to pay. So there's this finding also that says that in the US, some of them will say, like, I wouldn't go to a regular doctor, I wouldn't have my regular appointments, even if they're pregnant, although some states might have these programs where they will have the different doctor appointments, and they will wait to the very last moment, because either way they have to pay. So they could save money for having healthcare appointments the very first trimesters of their pregnancy. They will just wait until the very end. So they don't know if they're having a good or a healthy pregnancy. They will just go with the ride. So what we're trying to do with the different programs that we have in Ibero and with other partners that we have, and it's, first of it, how do we send this information out to people, which is what we call difundir. How do we tell to others, this is what is happening in Mexico with Central Americans, but it's also happening with the documented in the US. And then the other one is really having them understand with the facts, numbers, the impact, and also the money and that hasn't been invested in healthcare. And the other one is getting people close to these stories to really have them understand that we're talking about people that, with Central Americans, we have a lot of them that will have accidents as they're going in the train, La Bestia, and all this. And they might be young people from 18 years that are already losing one of their, an arm or a foot, and they're not going to be allowed to do a good job back if they are able to continue the trip. So they might have to stay in Mexico, try to find a job, and it's going to be really hard to find a job in those conditions. And the other one is promote that more people get involved, to volunteer. So we have different fundings that were allowed us to have during the COVID times to give just information. So for Central Americans, we had this different information that we provide to some shelters. We will say you have access to a doctor. You could go to a clinic and they have to take care of you. And they can ask you for your, as we said, same in the US. The reality is that in the practice, it might be different. And also, what we've been doing is this type of immersion programs, when we might have some of the students like you that later on will go back to their countries and just spread the word what is happening regarding healthcare. And also, we do a lot of donations and different campaigns where we might have these basic needs supplies or medical care supplies. But the most important is also how do we provide to the people that is working in those areas? How do we tell nurses or the people that is in a hospital, in a public hospital, that they need to take care of those people here in Mexico? But also, how do we provide some input for the people that works in a shelter? It's a really hard work that they do, and it just drains their energy. So we also have been developing different programs and different leadership programs when we provide them some input also, and that they know. So some of those have a better network, and they might have already a doctor that is really open and volunteering to go to a shelter and just provide an input regarding like a medical appointment, but it's just like a really basic checkup for immigrants. And that's the same thing that we've been doing in these nonprofits that we work in the US, when we have also translate all the information that might be available. Although we know that some of them don't know how to read even in Spanish. So we have to do a really strong campaign in just seeing face-to-face with the people and tell them, look, there is this possibility. It doesn't mean that you're going to lose or risk your chance of getting later on your regular migration or you're doing your residence. But they need to understand that the better they, or the sooner they will go to have some health checkups, it will just improve the whole community because we have healthy people. But mostly now we're focusing on children because that's where we need to put the effort. There's this story from one our students that work right now in an organization in New York. When they see this teenager, I believe she's right now 500 pounds, like really, and she's a teenager. And it's because of the trauma when she was crossing the border and different things that happened to her as she was crossing the border with her family. And she have now depression, and what she does is she eats. And she doesn't have any healthcare access. We know what's going to happen with these teenagers. So they traveled, they were looking for a better life, and because all the trauma and everything that she experienced during the whole crossing, now she's even worse than if she was staying here in Mexico because she's Mexican. So this is just one example of the different things that are happening. And healthcare with mental health is one of the one that we haven't been able to really strengthen. And we're hoping that we could develop different partnerships when we could provide this, because we're just taking care of basic needs and right away seeing the emergency on the emergency rooms, and we have many of undocumented people where we are working on preventing this other area. So I think that was the very last one that I have. Well, I just want to share this portrait. This is from one of the shelters that is located in Nogales, Sonora, which is right in the crossing border. And they have different, and it's just for bringing you that this is a Catholic shelter when they are providing aid for the people that's about to cross, and they were just returnees or deported from U.S. And it have different symbolism. So as you can see, there's like water in one corner. There's like the blanket that they might take if they're crossing through the desert. But it's also the different types of aid that they're getting. But as you can see, there isn't anything related with health in that one, like really, really nurture health. So this is just an example. It's hagan esto en memoria mía, which is come from the Bible, and just doing this in my memory and kind of just do it through the religious aid, that it's the one that really supports. And here, at least in Mexico, it's the one that really strengthens more than any other type of public institution. So I will just leave it there. I think I'm good with time. Okay. Okay. So that's it. Thank you.
So it's time if you have questions.
Has schooling or education been used or been thought to be used as a method of spreading awareness about nutrition or as a source of counseling for children for the different needs that you mentioned?
Do you mean like if it's been working with education, more like workshops or?
Are like school counselors or programs, nutrition programs, a possible method of support for children?
Yes, in the U.S. we are able to be placed on those WIC centers, the Women and Infant and Children Centers. So we have nutrition students there that will help them to just, because they have this card when they could buy all the different cereals, and so our students will go and do a different health plan and say like, yeah, this is super sweet, you can have this if you're pregnant, and just kind of give them a little bit of input. But that will go more for pregnancy because we're allowed in that one. And the challenge that we have is that we can't really be as professionals there because we don't have the license, or our students don't have the license. They're undergrad, but it works very well with the after-school programs. There are most of those based in the nonprofit organizations or in the same schools that might have after-school programs. So those are the ones that we've been able to provide a little bit more information for kids. So I would say it's not enough. And again, one thing is giving them the information, and the other one is that you could really get like this type of the strawberries really strike everyone, because then it's like, then what could I say? That she could only have, and I don't know if you had read this research that talk about the red fingers, where like from the hot Cheetos. So there's like this big story about if you go in a poverty area in the big cities like Chicago, where we work most of it, or New York, you will see the little kids or toddlers who have like their 2 fingers that are red, and these are from Cheetos, because those are the snacks that they're getting, because it's that one, I think 50 cents that you could buy one of these bags. So we learn to say that they have snacks, but the reality is that what they could offer are those hot Cheetos. This is more in the food deserts.
How many students do you send from India? Is it like part of their classes, credit? Is it like an internship, or does it work?
We have the social service program. So in Mexico, in order to graduate, every single student from any university has to fill 480 hours of service. So we have program specific for that could work our country in these cities. So the student could apply to go to these programs, and we only send like the high qualification students that have like really social engagement and that maybe had worked before on migration topics, because it's really important they understand where they're going and with the difficulties that they are already experiencing. So that's the way that we do it. We also have, we partner now with professional practices with the same organizations. So that allows them to even stay longer, which is really what we're looking forward, or that they could just do both in one way. And in that way, we have more students because it's still expensive for them to go and fund this opportunity.
Well, thank you. I also have some comments. The first one, Eva already did, but that's fine. The second one, I'm interested about knowing how many projects does Ibero have, and also if you could also tell us a little bit about the organizations that are Ibero's partners in these activities.
So we have right now, and it shifted from COVID times when we, some of the nonprofits that we work with closed. So that was, that's a bit of a challenge. So in the US, because we also do kind of the same work here with some shelters, and as the picture that I show you from Nogales, but in the US we work mostly with New York. We have Mixteca and Mexican Coalition. One is located in the Bronx, one is located in Brooklyn. High density of Mexican migrants in that area. And both are just social services, nonprofits. So some of them might have nutrition programs, counseling, legal counseling also, and they might have ESL classes, cooking classes. It's more like a community center in New York. In Chicago, we work with Family Sister Services, which is only for counseling, but we don't do counseling. We do this other part of all the information that needs to be in Spanish. So we'll be like really friendly for people, because the thing is the stigma of looking for mental health. So there's a big stigma. So we kind of help more in that communications area. And we partner with Loyola University, and that's how we have the internship program with Loyola University, and it's in the CIRA program, CIRA Center, which is Center for Immigration and Refugee Accompaniment Center. That's the name. So that's where we have our students, and some of them might work more in policy briefs, and also to make them be more friendly for immigrants, but also right now they're just working on helping translating in different offices and with the consulate. But we do it through Loyola University. We are also working, although we haven't sent students because part of this is also to understand where it's more like bigger the need. It's in El Paso, Texas, where we think maybe during the fall we'll start working. And that's also for helping on paperwork, as they're doing more under the undocumented or regulating their status.
And can you comment about the organizations with which Ibero works here in Mexico?
So here in Mexico, we work in the south, in Tapachula, that I comment a little bit, when they do a lot of paperwork, and mostly paperwork because they already settled there. And also we work with the different shelters. And we work in Mexico City with two organizations that they do more outreach and advocacy. So we help them more about doing outreach, all this data, and translate it into campaigns and give them more information about what is happening with Central American immigration, but also with the people that it's migrating from Mexico. And in the north border, we had worked with a migrant shelter in Coahuila, which is one of the biggest. We have students that will just go and do different activities, the day-to-day basis, the needs that they might have, but also specific programs. And right now, we also have one of our students in Nogales, Sonora. They're one of our shelter programs.
And finally, have you considered working with returned migrants, Mexican returned migrants?
Yes, we do. I didn't cover that much, but we have two different organizations here that we work with returning migrants. The thing, and I think it was something that already Miguel said, it's they don't feel really ashamed, and they are embarrassed. So we haven't been able to work that beyond with them because they think they are already empowered and they don't need any of those. And I think, and again, I will go back to this mental care or health care that it's needed, and we should be working a little bit stronger on that. But they don't get that close. So we have some programs, and with here it's Coalición Mexicana and also PETS, which are the two ones that we work. And what they've been doing is empower some of these business. So right now with the PETS, I know they're working and with this PET transformation, which is all the plastic industry, and they're trying to do some, and also the empower their culture. So those are the only two that we're working here in specific in Puebla.
With returning my.
With Returne.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
And also, we have a plan that Professor Estefania is going to be visiting South Bend in April. And we are going to explore the possibility to work in South Bend in two places. Is El Campito or Casa de Amistad?
I'm not quite sure.
I think you are going to be visiting both. You are going to be visiting both because both places have children who are being born in the U.S. and they are from Mexican families mostly. So
I live just down the street from Casa La Amistad.
so you can join Professor Estefania in April. Thank you, Professor. So now we are going to give the time to Professor Alfredo Cuecuecha.
Who's awaiting his
Sorry.
students.
I'm sorry?
He's awaiting his students.
Oh, do you want us to wait a little bit more?
No, that's fine. I think we can go ahead.
Yeah?
Yes.
Or perhaps because the door is closed, they're not coming in. I'm going to check.
Just please, if you can check quickly. Well, let me tell you a little bit about this project. This project is actually an ongoing research, and it's a joint research with Professor Norma Fuentes Mayorga. She works at City College of New York. Basically, I will say that this work was inspired by a talk with Jairo Guzman. Jairo Guzman is actually the president of one of these organizations that Estefania was talking about, which is Mexican Coalition, which basically is an organization of, Jairo is already an American citizen, so basically he is an American citizen that has a non-profit organization that helps not only Mexicans, but also Central Americans living in the New York area. Basically, I think they work with people that go as far as Connecticut. They work also with people from New Jersey. And basically, this talk started because he asked me whether I knew something about what was going on with the project, with a project that the Mexican government used to have, which was called 3x1. And basically, I started to research the subject. It turns out that it is a very well researched subject, but I will say that so far it has been seen is like one of those cases in which it is a complex issue and it has been studied from very different perspectives. When I was starting researching this topic, I realized that what you really need is more like a transdisciplinary approach because it is really a complex issue. You will see in a moment what I mean for that. And basically, the way I try to introduce this project is about the question that came to my mind when I was told about this project, and it's basically thinking about collective remittances as a source of tax income for municipalities that have transnational citizens. And basically, what are collective remittances? Basically, this type of collective remittances are money donated by migrant organizations that has been used for very different purposes in their origin communities. Turns out that there are some scholars that have studied the topic, and they have seen that some of these migrant organizations, there is some history about them existing since at least the 1970s. Most of the stories are about organizations that originated in Zacatecas, Mexico, and to the point that by 1992, that is like 20 years after the first migrant club started to organize this type of collective remittances, the state government of Zacatecas realized that it was a good idea and started to try to partner with these migrant organizations and basically started the program called 2x1, which basically the migrant organizations will get donations, and then the municipality will give $1 more, and then the state government will give $1 more. That's why it was called 2x1. And then in 1999, the entire idea was offered to candidate Vicente Fox, which then in 2000 became president of Mexico. And he liked the idea very much and transformed this program into a federal program, which was called 3x1, where basically the migrant organizations will get money donated, $1, and then the municipalities will get $1 more, and then the state will get $1 more, and then the federal government will come up with $1 additional. So that was sort of like the idea of how this entire collective remittances worked in Mexico. So now this takes us to some very specific questions, like for example, why did migrants donate money in the first place? As I was telling you, at least the story from the part of the scholars that have studied this topic is that in the 1970s, migrants organized migrant clubs that started to look at do some social and community projects, like for example, trying to rebuild churches, rebuild public plazas, and things like that. Sometimes there are other scholars have also documented that in some cases it was not the migrant organization in the United States, but it was the organization in Mexico, the one that requested the money from the migrants in the U.S. For example, there is one case in Sinaloa, Mexico, in a place called El Elote, where basically the church started to organize religious organizations to try to rebuild, I think, the cemetery. And basically they start to ask for money from their Mexicans, migrants in the US. And so in that regard, I would say that for some scholars like Smith, which is he started to do some research about these different organizations, and he basically claims that in some sense these collective remittances replicated the organization that took place in Mexico for many years before. Because in many cases these religious organizations in some cases date back to pre-Hispanic times, okay? Or the colonial times. So in that regard, that's how all this type of collective work dates back in history. I think it's here. Yes. So this led me to look in the literature about why do people donate money. And basically, there are different stories and theories that have been written about. Some of them relate to the idea that usually donation of money reflects some type of altruism. And also, there are different theories that have been written about why people are motivated to donate money. And some of them say that there are certain direct motives, and some of them are called indirect motives. Direct motives refer to the fact that, for example, the individuals develop empathy. I mean, they feel related to the person that perhaps they feel is suffering, and because of that, they donate money. In some other cases, the indirect motivation is called herd behavior, which basically means that when you look at your friend that is donating money, then you feel that you want to donate money too, okay? And there is also another topic which is called social information, which basically refers also to this idea that sometimes individuals may feel social pressure to participate into something, right? And it's a little bit different from the indirect motivation, because in a way, in the indirect motivation, when I look to my friend that is donating money, I feel that I want to donate money too. And in the other case, is my friend that is asking me to donate money. Okay, so it's kind of a different way in which the donation works. But basically, out of these ideas, some authors made a classification of clubs that at some point worked with this program. Some of them are called clubs from the base, which basically they were organized by the migrants, or they were organized by some religious organization. And after that, they became interested in the program and started to try to carry out social infrastructure projects. Like, for example, sometimes they will say, okay, let's rebuild the street, or let's build water infrastructure, things like that. On the other hand, the scholars that have researched the topic, they also have seen that in some cases, the migration clubs were organized from the top. By that, what they mean is that many times the state, sometimes the federal government, sometimes the state government, or sometimes the municipality government, they wanted to receive the funds that were created by the federal government. But for them to receive the funds, they needed to have migrant clubs. And so they start to, to go and tell migrants, do you want to form a migrant club? And that's how these migrant clubs were formed too. In total, the program in 2002 started with $10 million. And it had around 924 projects, and it helped 247 municipalities. The program reached its peak in 2009, when basically it in total managed $50 million and 2,421 projects. But then, at least during the 2013-2019 period, the program started to receive less support by the federal government, at least in terms of dollars. These years coincide with a period in which the Mexican peso became more weak, and therefore, even though the budget in pesos remained constant or grew a little bit, in dollars, the total amount of the project became to go down. At the end, in 2019, and the reason why I spoke about the end is because basically 2019 was the last year in which the program worked. The program did many different projects, some of them in social infrastructure, like water projects, community service, like, for example, basketball courts, educative projects in which they will, take care of some school. And sometimes even they started to work with something which was called productive projects, which basically were like, they were trying to help people to start business. I would say that the program was a little bit complicated. In fact, the rules of operation, which basically determine who was able to obtain money and how much, almost changed every 6 years. So in that regard, I would say that it's not like a regular public program in which there is a set of rules and a moment in time after which you can say, okay, before this period, the policies took this type, but in this case, the policies were changing continuously almost every 6 years. In general, however, the idea was that the migrant clubs in the US would select a project and in principle would offer it to CEDESOL, and then CEDESOL and the state office of that government agency will select the projects, and then the municipality and the state will select the company that will build the infrastructure. So you might think, why is it the case that we want to see at this detail of the operation of the project? Because turns out that the project, or many of the projects end up having problems in how they work it in each one of these stages, which generated a lot of complicated effects that I will explain in a little bit more. For example, according to some studies done by Colegio de México, this type of design, of program design, generating different types of results. Basically, they said that in general there was a type of projects that actually follows the rules of operation, which basically mean that they were chosen by the migrant clubs. Then they were monitored by mirror clubs. What was a mirror club? Basically, the US organization will organize a club in Mexico, and the club in Mexico will be like a social controller. That means they will follow the resources, they will follow who will receive the resources and everything. And so at the end, many of these projects are considered to have been satisfactory, at least for the migrant clubs. If you go and ask to the migrant clubs, they will say, we work very well with the Mexican government and we were able to do our project. But if you go with the population, then the population sometimes will say that the project was not what they wanted, really. That it was more like the decision of the migrant clubs. That I would say is the first type of programs that work, of projects that work it. There are other projects that, however, were not chosen by, I will say, sorry, they were chosen by non-migrants. In this case, the projects were selected by the Mirror Club. Basically, they were the ones that said, we want this project to be done. And then they look for some migrant club that will generate the validation of the project, which basically they will say, hey, do you want to do this project in Mexico? And then the migrant club will say, yes, we will say that we wanted that project. And then at the end, different evaluations have shown that this type of projects generated satisfaction at the local level, i.e. the population in the localities that received these projects, they were happy with the project. But the problem is that many migrant clubs remain skeptical, okay? Because they said, no, this was not chosen by us. This was chosen by the people in Mexico, and consequently, we don't know whether the project was needed on the first place, okay? And then there are other projects that I would say are the projects that are more problematic, because in many cases, these projects were chosen by the authority. In these cases, the local authorities will select the project. They will look for mirror clubs and for migrant clubs. And basically, at the end, these were the worst projects, because basically there was non-satisfaction at the local level, okay? There was a lot of mistrust from migrant clubs, and there are also many stories that many of these projects were, at the end, only a way to generate corruption, okay? So basically, as you can see, the evaluation of this program show us that the program was very complicated, and at the end it also generated very complex results, okay? Now, there are different studies that claim that part of the reason with the program is that the program, in some sense, was not well designed. And why is that? Because basically, in Mexico, the federal funds are, in principle, allocated according to the main objective or main goal that you want to do with that money. By that I mean, for example, in the case of 3x1, many of these projects, the communities wanted really to develop their social infrastructure, okay? Unfortunately, the Mexican government decided to classify these funds in something which is called Ramo 20, which basically means that money was supposedly to be used to combat poverty. So what that generated was like a problem, because if, let's suppose an ideal case, you have a migrant club in the United States. They all come from very poor location in Mexico, and they decide to organize a club, and they want to build social infrastructure in that very poor location. In that case, everything will work perfectly, because basically the community is poor, and in that regard, the funds that are being allocated to it by the Mexican federal government are going to the right place, because it's supposed to be money that is being spent in combating poverty, okay? But suppose you have another case in which, for example, the migrants come from a community that is not very poor, right? And they said, we want to build social infrastructure. What will happen is, if the project gets approved, the money will be spent in a locality that, according to Mexican rules, is not considered very poor. And what that means is that the money will end up being used in a place that wasn't poor to begin with, okay? So basically that was observed by a study done by Aparicio and Meseguer in 2012. And what they were able to find is that basically the places that were receiving 3x1 were not the communities that were poorer in Mexico. But again, in my opinion, this was a mistake in the design of the program, because basically, if you think a little bit, all communities require money to provide public goods, right? No matter how rich a community is, it always will require funds to generate public goods. Just think, for example, New York City, right? New York City is a very large city. I will say it is one of the wealthiest cities in the United States, and it still needs funds, to pay for the transportation, for health services, and for many other reasons. So basically, the need for supplying public goods is not linked to the level of wealth of that city. All cities need public goods, okay? So in that regard, the funds were wrongly allocated in the case of the Mexican government, okay? As you can see, this is a little bit perhaps too, a little bit obscure, right? So I will go to the next, thing, or to the next idea of what went wrong with this program, and basically it had to do with the selection process. And basically here, in the case of the selection process, I will say that the fact that the projects had to go through so many ways to decide what was done eventually generated a lot of basically confusion and eventually corruption. Because basically at some points, yes, the migrant clubs had the opportunity to select the projects, but in many cases, the migrant clubs didn't have a say on what was done, okay? They were only used to basically justify the use of the public goods, of the public funds, sorry. So in that regard, this generated something that in the literature is called capture. Basically, the money is captured by local elites, or the money is captured by local politicians that simply use the funds for something else from a good use. And what this suggests is that basically, perhaps it's not so clear what would have been done in this case in order to improve things. But basically, there are many literature that claims that what you need to do for improving the governance of these projects is that you should give more power to the citizens. Basically, you need to increase how much citizens participate, not only in the selection of the projects, but also in the controlling of those projects. And that's basically what requires is more transparency in the selection process, and more transparency in all the bureaucratic process needed for these projects to work. What else went wrong? Well, something which, as I said at some point, I told you about the construction process. Turns out that because it was also a very obscure process, it was not clear who was supposed to build these projects. Because in principle, the government will provide the income, but not necessarily provide the company that will construct the projects. And what this generated was that in many cases, especially in the projects that were in a say control by the state municipalities. Remember that I told you that there was one case of projects that were controlled by the municipality, who was the one that generated the clubs, the migrant clubs. the clubs from the top. Okay, so in those type of projects, there are many stories about the fact that many of those projects they had a lot of over costs. Basically, a small pencil will be very expensive, or sometimes the quality of the materials will be of bad quality. And what that generated is that in many cases the population didn't like those projects, and basically many of these projects became abandoned after they were given by the authority to the community. So as you can see, this also tells us that if you want to do a project, you need to design better how the institution will work in order to avoid corruption in all the process of delivery of public goods. And basically, this is a little bit what the literature says, that you need more transparent construction process. For example, establish like a registry of constructors. Also establish rules to avoid concentration of projects on certain constructors with no previous experience, or also establish a social controller, which basically will be something like a social committee with members of the community and migrant clubs. Basically, will give more power to the society, right, in order to decide what projects are done, but later on also increase the social vigilance of these projects. With all, you might say, what were the results? I mean, even if we, for a moment, abstract from all these complexities, what did the different evaluations that have been done about the 3x1 set? Well, basically, there are many evaluations. Perhaps the more important is one done by Duquette and Rory in 2014. And basically, what they did find is that basically, the results show that there is more welfare among poor households once they receive 3x1, because the access to infrastructure like water, sanitation, and drainage increased. Even though the evaluation done by Aparicio and Meseguer in 2012 found that localities that were more likely to receive 3x1 were less likely to be poor. Okay? So I would say that what that tells us is that poverty exists in all municipalities, and once you see inside the municipality, you will still find poor individuals, poor households. Okay? So that's why my argument is that the funds needed to be seen in a different way. They had to be seen more like the provision of public goods. And in that regard, if you look at these funds in that way, donations are one way to generate tax income for localities. Okay? One more thing that was noted by Torres and Kuznetsov in 2006 is that many of the projects, none of them provided funds for maintenance. So, for example, if they said we're going to build water pipes, they didn't have any money for later on, maintaining those water pipes. Also, there are other studies, one done by Carlan and List in 2007, in which what they did is they tried to see whether the change of regime between 3x1 or 2x1 compared to the time where neither the state government nor the federal government participated, whether there was a difference. And what Carlan and List showed is that basically the collective remittances remain similar. Okay, so basically there was no influence of the program 3x1 in the amount of collective remittances that were being received by the communities in Mexico. And finally, some of the final evaluations of the project, for example, in 2017, there is one evaluation by Ortega which says that the program already was very obscure and it had already too much control by the authorities, okay? Basically, Capelletti in 2018, he claims that at that time, many of the projects were no longer being chosen by the migrant clubs, that they were really being chosen by the local political authorities. So as you can see, the program simply became a disaster by 2018. And even some authors like Gamlen in 2008 claims that the program at some point became a way in which the local politicians would prove how strong they were and how many people were, they would be able to carry out to political demonstrations and things like that. So basically in 2019, the program eventually ended and the federal government, the current Mexican federal government, basically established other type of programs, claiming that these other programs will be the way to reduce poverty. And these programs are something which is called Construyendo el Futuro, Building the Future, which are basically like scholarships given to young individuals that are working with some companies. And also there is something called, which is Becas Benito Juárez, which is a scholarship Benito Juárez, which is also money given to students to remain in the university and high school. And there are also other money that is being disbursed to people that are 65 and over. And there is also something called Sembrando el Futuro, will be like sowing the future, or which is basically money given to farmers. And there is something called Tandas del Bienestar, which are sort of like credits given for small businesses, or micro businesses, sorry. But the point is, what can be lost? Turns out that even though the program worked not very well, the truth is that the program did increase the budget of certain communities, particularly communities that had migrant population, transnational populations. And in that regard, those incomes, to the extent that were actually used in increasing, for example, water pipelines, drainage, if those communities didn't have enough budget to generate that social infrastructure, this will eventually generate an increase in something that in Mexico is called multidimensional poverty, which is basically poverty that is measured by your access to, for example, to clean water, drainage, etc., right? That is not necessarily measured by income, but is instead measured by your access to those social services. On the other hand, there are also these many other studies that have been done by social scientists, specialists in politics. They claim that actually the program generated social capital, because what they claim is that the community, in those communities that it actually worked, it somehow served to generate social cohesion, because basically the people organize themselves to work around a common project, okay? So the idea is that perhaps in those communities where actually the program worked, social cohesion will reduce. On the other hand, the program itself also increased local government income or expenditure, because it turns out that for many of these small municipalities that actually were poor municipalities that were receiving 3x1, the amount received in income for this program was in fact important. And what this suggests is that we still don't know, because there are by now nobody has already measured this. So I will say that this is like future research that could be done, because basically if some evaluations found that the program increased the capacity of the local governments to generate social infrastructure, you could think that if you eliminate the programs, now you could potentially see the opposite, right? That the local communities will not have the budget to generate social infrastructure. So that would lead to an increase in multidimensional poverty. Also, it could be the case, nobody has done so far also this research, is what happened with social cohesion, i.e. what happened with all these social organizations that organized around the program. And there are some studies already, I forgot to put it here, but there is one study that claims that in the case of the migrant clubs that were organized from above, you perhaps will not observe a reduction in social capital, but in the case of the bad migrant clubs, the ones that were organized by the local governments, those researchers claim that perhaps those bad migrant clubs will be eliminated. On the other hand, nobody also has studied already about what happened with local income. By this, we mean what happened with the budgets of the local governments, whether the local government's income actually reduced because of the elimination of the program. I actually have started to work a little bit about this idea. It's a little bit complicated, but we are trying to get all the databases together. But basically, this is something that is a working project. And why is it the case that local income could reduce? Well, what we think is, on the one hand, if you eliminate 3x1, the municipalities that received those funds will, of course, lose the access to the 3x1, which means federal income, state income, right? We think that municipality income wouldn't change because, in many cases, the municipality income itself would, I will say, would use some of its resources to put the money for the 3x1. But the money that is lost is the donations that the migrant clubs decided to put for these projects. And also, it could be the case that if those donations made by the migrant clubs, if they actually generated what the donation literature says, that once you see somebody donating money, you might feel inclined to donate money too. So the argument is, if you see less people donating money, then less people will be donating money too. So that's kind of the demonstration effect, right? That could take place with the disappearance of 3x1. Another fundamental question is whether cash transfers that have been done or that are being done by the current federal government can actually substitute 3x1. And our argument is that no, it cannot. Because even though now you're giving the money directly to individuals, this additional effect that for the municipalities that receive 3x1 is gone. Basically, those additional incomes that were going to those municipalities from the state and from the federal government basically are now gone. And we also think that because of that, it is important then to consider how the importance of the collective remittances for many of these municipalities to generate tax income, okay? And in my opinion, it is a complicated issue because, in fact, I have looked in the literature of public finance whether there is any model about how can you actually organize taxation based on voluntary donations. And there is not much written about it in the literature. So as you can see, it's a really complex issue because it really is a transnational taxation policy, okay? And that's part of the research agenda. How to study the effects of the disappearance on 3x1 on state income and expenditure, how to study the effects of the disappearance of 3x1 on municipality income and expenditure, and also study the effects of the disappearance of 3x1 on the provision of public goods to households and in multidimensional poverty. And perhaps something that has come to my mind, and also I was talking with another researcher, his name is Gonzalo Castañeda. He came to give a talk here, and I was talking to him about this project, and he was telling me how we might need develop a model that is a little bit more complicated because the complexity of the fiscal problem, right? Because you are talking about a transnational policy where you want to convince your citizens in Mexico to pay taxes, and you want to convince your transnational citizens that live already in the United States to give donations for your economy, right? And then the many interesting questions come about, like for example, how much of the public expenditure must be done on public goods for the entire community and particularly for the transnational community. And this, in my opinion, is very important for Mexico because Professor Miguel was talking about return migration, which is a very important issue in Mexico. Many of these migrants want to return to Mexico, but the question is to what kind of community they want to return. Do they want to return to the same old community with all the limitations that it had, or they want to return to a better community, right? I was actually in a conference also 3 weeks ago, and I was, for some coincidence, I found someone that was a president of Mexican Migrant Club, and he was telling me exactly that point. He was telling me the reason why we participated in this program is because we wanted to change, the reality of our communities. And we were not interested in politics, but it seems that every time we wanted to do something good, all politicians will come around, and ask for our help, right? And so he said to me, it's complicated, right? Because we only want to do good, but people in Mexico want us to become politicians, which is something we don't want to be, right? They only wanted to change the reality of their community, but of course, it was a complicated issue. So that's what we think, that perhaps trying to model these ideas using something which in economics has been called like agent-based models, that basically use a little bit of, a lot of computational economics, and try to model how these complex fiscal situations could be modeled. And that's the end of my presentation.
So can I ask about the data? So do you know who applied for funds for the 3x1? Do you have like the federal data on how many clubs applied, or at the state level or municipality?
Actually, that's a very good question, because turns out that the Secretaría, the federal ministry that managed the money was Secretaría de Solidaridad. It already disappeared. And now it's called Secretaría del Bienestar, something like Welfare Ministry. So what we don't know is whether the data or the files were safe. So we still are in trying to locate those files. Something that I have thought is that some of these researchers, they might be willing to share the data.
Because I was wondering, so can you identify in the data where the idea came from? Like, so you had the 3 scenarios, right? Either it was like driven by the actual stakeholders in the community, or the migrant clubs, or the politicians. Like, can you figure out which projects were kind of taking which route, or is that impossible?
I think we can do it, but not necessarily for all the data set. We think that is something that we are planning to do. Part of the way I think we can solve that is by actually talking to the presidents of the migrant clubs, because they are the ones that they are going to tell us, yes, we did it, or no.
Because I can see, right, that there's a lot of indigeneity, so there's issues trying to figure it out. So I was wondering if, because you mentioned there was a budget, right, that the federal government had a budget for this, if there were any times where the budget was binding, so there would be a club that came forth proposing a project, but they would get denied because money has run out, that you could sort of exploit that as a random variation of when they applied and where they didn't. If they ever reached the max, that they would get rejected.
Yes, that in fact I think will be excellent, but that will require us to have the actual information of the applications. I'm not sure, I don't know if that data exists, but I think there might be ways to get at the data sample. I think my idea right now is try to focus on at least the state of Puebla, and try to go and interview the presidents of the migrant clubs of Puebla, and try to identify from them the projects that they work with, and try to see if we can find the documents of all the projects that were done in Puebla, so that we can figure it out, okay, exactly this, were organized from the bottom, these were organized from the top. And that's why I think it can be done, because otherwise I don't see how we can figure it out. Yeah.
Actually, the remittance don't pay taxes in USA. But how would be your proposal about the taxation treatment of the income of the migrants? Or
Miguel.
how would be the proposal to benefit in any way to the migrants in the USA, or no?
Well, I just want you to remember that right now, I will say that migrants, to the extent that they are using, I mean, if they are undocumented, and to the extent that they are using someone's social security number, you will say that they are paying that part of tax, right? It's not that they are making the taxes, because I think they are not allowed to, or are they?
Oh, you can pay taxes whether you're documented or
Or
undocumented.
not.
We'll always take your money. Yeah.
Okay.
That's not a problem.
That means if you want to pay your taxes, you will pay your taxes. And then the point with the collective remittances is that they will be expenses that you will not be able to deduct, right? I don't think you can deduct remittances that you send to Mexico.
No.
And that income has to be taxed before, if it's not an under the table, right? If it's a transaction that happens in the shadows, then nothing's taxed and nothing's claimed. But if it's an income that you claim, the remittances come, that's your consumption choice, right?
Right.
That is after tax.
Yes. So in that regard, if, as Professor Eva is saying, if the money came already from income that you obtained through a social security number, it already paid taxes.
If the microcaps are registered in the U.S. though, as like charitable organizations,
They might.
you might be able to get a deduction on your taxes for donations. Though.
Right.
Yeah.
So-
It will be on the income tax.
It might. Under certain circumstances, it might. It may be the case, depending if, for example, if the migrants want to do the taxes, and second, as Eva says, if the migrant club is registered as a non-profit in the U.S., then it may be able to claim that money being sent to Mexico is actually a donation. Now, once the income arrived to Mexico, that's the other part of the story. And that's what makes it complicated, because once it arrived to Mexico, it is given to municipality, it became part of the budget of the municipality, okay? So that's the marvelous part of these collective remittances, because you are collecting tax income through donations. What this means is that the local income of the municipality will see an increase once it receives the donation, okay? Even though the money came out from outside Mexico. Okay, so in that regard, it will increase income tax in Mexico. Okay, the budget of the municipality. Okay, in my opinion, this is an excellent idea. For example, let's suppose Puebla City is supposed to receive a very large amount of remittances. Not sure if it is because people that receive remittances live in Puebla, or if only because of convenience they receive their remittances in Puebla City. But for example, you could think about the idea that, for example, Puebla will say, let's build a subway, right? And we are going to collect money from all Poblanos living in the United States, right? And if Poblanos want to contribute, they can give whatever amount of dollars they want, and then you can build the subway of Puebla, okay? That will be the idea of why collective remittances may be a good idea, after all. And of course, it's a window of opportunity that can exist so long as these migrants live in the work and live in the United States.
So my question is, you explain us how the program 3Y1 is supported by federal government and local governments and everything. So once the local government has increased the budget and this money has been captured by the political elites, that means that Mexico has corruption and it's not going to disappear that easily. The state is leaving a void in these poor communities. So the state is not being able to provide basic goods for these communities, like access to water, electricity, education, food, roads, whatever. So my question is, in this scenario of global governance, where there are several actors involved, because these are transnational communities, it's people working in the United States and people in Mexico receiving money, who could fulfill the void that the state is leaving? Like, what other actor can intervene to fulfill these necessities for the people? Like, could it be the migrant clubs, as you said before, or maybe a big enterprise or something like that?
I would say that's a very good question, and in a way, I think I touched a little bit about that topic on my presentation, and I would say is civil society, right? Because of course you could say, well, the government, you can form a government agency that will look after that part, right? But the truth of the story is that in Mexico we mistrust a lot our government agencies, right? Because we always fear that they are going to, basically stole the money,
Yes.
right? So I would say that the best answer would be the civil society. I mean, in a way, in many cases, things have worked like that already. I mean, in many cases in Zacatecas, and in fact here in Puebla, the president of one of these Mexican clubs explained to me that he had actually worked with two projects, one in a cemetery and another one, I think it was a street that they paved. And basically what he said is that at least in those projects, they were able to select the company that make the reconstruction of the cemetery, and also the company that pave the road. And I will say that those are good examples, or in a way, of good practices, because at least because it was the money of the migrant club, they had a very strong voice on deciding how the money was spent, what company will do the construction, and eventually that the project will be given to the society. So in that regard, I think it will be the civil society. I think it will be the best answer, right? Because at least in Mexico, I think we all are very suspicious of any government agency. Right?
Thank you.
I also would look into I was fascinated by the exchange rate changes. I would look whether you can kind of pick up on the substitution income effect of the remittances during that period. I think that would be fascinating.
Yes, that I think something that it may be already.
Somebody looked at that?
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I'm not sure somebody has already looked at it, but I think it's something very interesting to do.
Cool.
Yes.
I need my.
Bueno, Jairo, estaban trabajando bien en las comunidades, ¿verdad?
Sí.